I want to tell you a story, and it's far from a fairy tale. It's a story that takes place in 2010, just outside Atlanta. A little place you probably never heard of, called Forest Park.
When I moved to Forest Park, it was a nice suburb, not too much crime.
It's a nice place. That's why Myleek and everyone at Forest Park High couldn't believe it when their friend, 15-year-old Candice Parchment, goes missing. Within 6 hours, Candice's mother gets concerned and contacts the police.
The last time I remember seeing Candice, she had a bag of hot Cheetos. She had put a few of them in my mouth. She had fed me. We were in school. Everything was happy. That was the last day I've ever seen her.
Is this Captain Gandy interview, Colonel Mark?
I was the commander of the major felony unit of the Clayton County Police Department. On April 28th in 2010, Candice goes missing. And her mom reports this to the Clayton County Police and they file an incident report.
Candice's friends and family get more and more worried as time passes.
I was contacting her and she wasn't responding and stuff like that. I would post Facebook messages and put it on her wall and just tell me something, let me know you're okay. Just let me know you're okay, and nothing.
Candice just disappears, and her absence is felt. You see, everyone liked Candice. Candice is clever, bright eyes, big smile, the kind of girl that attracts attention at Forest Park High School. The kind of girl that might make other girls jealous.
The first time I met Candice was actually in the gym class. I was really interested in knowing, like, okay, what makes this girl stand out? What makes everyone want to be around her? She explained to me her family was from Jamaica and that they had recently migrated here to Georgia. We hit it off right then and there. She wanted to be a writer. Journalism, poetry, or music. Me personally, music is in my blood. I was daily recording music. Candice was one of my biggest fans even then, so she became a great friend of mine. She would always be jotting down in this composition book, documenting her life, so to speak, everything that she's seen, her thoughts, what she wanted to do. Candice would always say, we came to America to make better opportunity for us. And I'm gonna take care of my family. I'm gonna be somebody.
I wish I could say Candice got what she wanted. But this ain't that kind of story. When Candice goes missing on April 28th, 2010, her loved ones worry that law enforcement doesn't share their concern.
The police officers told Candice's family, friends, girls like this always do things like this. The girls like this always run away. Like, girls like what? What do you mean, girls like what? I would love to know. Feel free to contact me and let me know what that meant.
But on the day she goes missing, there is hope.
Later that day, Candice's mother received a text message from Candice's phone. The next day, Candice's mom gets another text.
But these texts, they don't really seem like Candice to those who know her.
Her mom never believed it. Like, nah, there's no way my daughter's in Tennessee. What would make you think that this young girl ran away, sent one text message to her mom saying, I'm in Tennessee, took no clothes, took any unnecessary items. She's 15 years old, doesn't have any money, doesn't have any job. It doesn't do much work like that.
But maybe there's a way to clear that up. If Candice ran 200 miles away to Tennessee, her phone records would show that's where the text was sent from. But no. Over a month goes by before investigators follow up on the texts.
On June 2nd, 2010, a detective files a subpoena request for Candice's phone records, and we never did hear anything back from the phone company.
They'll need to follow up on the phone records. Meanwhile, new cases continue to pour in.
When Candice was reporting missing, we were averaging probably 30 to 40 runaway reports a month, and just trying to manage runaways being located and clearing them and taking new reports. This takes time and a lot of money.
Dead in the water, I circled the truth.
7 months go by since she's been gone, and it feels like forever. And then, a call comes in.
911, what's your emergency?
I'm not sure, but I think we might have found something. Something human.
It's November 24th, 2010. A body is found in Candice Parchment's neighborhood, just a few hundred yards from her house. Remember when I said this isn't a fairy tale? It's true, but there are good people in the story.
My full name is Ashley Melvin. I was a homicide detective in Clayton County. In November 2010, I was the new kid. Captain said, "Hey, rookie, you're up." Found a body in the woods. I jumped in my car and I head to Forest Park. It was on Sylvia Drive. I was nervous and yeah, I did have butterflies in my stomach. I was directed toward the wooden path just to the left of the dumpster. And it's a little cut through. Start going through the wooden path. You could tell people have been using it for years, probably. Patrol officers were there standing by with the crime scene tape. And I looked down, and there was a body. Not in the conventional sense of a body, it was a skeleton. This is literally the first time I've actually seen a skeleton. And just seeing someone's bones, this was a person.
The body is so decomposed, but investigators are hopeful that there will be some obvious marker, some clue to tell them who this is.
We don't have any ID. There was no wallet, there's no purse, there was nothing to signify who the body was.
We did find a earring, and the jacket was still there. It was kind of like a snake skin. The t-shirt was a Stay Fresh t-shirt.
Investigators use the clothing to try to identify the body.
We started checking the social media. We found a picture that matched the jacket that we found. I mean, it was almost a perfect match. Scaly leather, rhinestones.
The body that was recovered that day was Candice Parchment.
News of the tragic discovery soon reaches Candice's loved ones.
I broke down in tears. I couldn't believe it.
Close your eyes.
She was just stuffed underneath the mattress, you know?
but it just keeps crashing down.
We went to her mother's house.
Shut it out, a wave upon
She asked, "Did you find my baby?"
let me drown. I tried to,
Yeah, that was tough.
I tried to, but I can't find you.
I made a promise to Candice's mother. I said, "I don't know what took place, but I'm gonna find out what happened, and if someone did it to your daughter, I'm gonna find out who did it."
I can't find you, but I can't find my peace of mind.
And the first thing investigators have to do is figure out the cause of death.
So the medical examiner ruled the death as a stab wound to the chest. The manner of death was determined to be a homicide.
So now I know I have my first homicide. And it's scary.
Who would want to kill a sweet girl like Candice? Investigators take to the streets to hunt down her killer.
We have teams out doing the canvas. Did anybody see anything?
But no one knew anything.
Then, they turned to her school, Forest Park High. Candice was popular. She had many friends. Any of them could know something. Anything. And any of them could have been capable of anything. Even Myleik.
The detectives questioned me. They asked for my phone, trying to see what text messages in between us. I believe they were looking at me as though I might have perpetrated the event or something.
Could one of Candice's closest friends somehow be involved in her death? Myleik Hamlet is now a person of interest in Candice Parchman's murder.
And what we were doing is called victimology, and that's learning the habits, the social workings of the victim.
You wasting your time looking at my phone, trying to see what text messages in between us. You want to see what we're talking about?
As investigators continue to look at Myleik and other friends,
Literally, no one knew anything.
everyone is a potential suspect.
There were so many rumors. She ran away with a trucker. She was in Tennessee.
But some of those rumors were a little too real and hit a little too close to home.
There was a rumor that there was a serial killer in the area picking up people.
Monica Ambrose disappeared on October 16th, 2010, just outside Atlanta. Girl was 17. They found her 10 days later in an abandoned building, stabbed. And Detective Melvin and his fellow investigators start to see similarities between Monica and Candice's cases.
The victim is similar to Candice. Young girls, same vicinity, both stabbed in the chest.
There's one person investigators think could have killed the two young girls.
Artemio Hernandez. He killed Monica, a 17-year-old girl, just a few weeks earlier in the same area, approximately 2 miles away. He did a lot of things. And if Candice was his first victim, then we had a serial killer in our midst in Forest Park.
Artemio Hernandez, armed robbery, rape, murder. Did he kill Candice? Stab her? Just like he did to Monica? With the prime suspect in their sights, investigators launch a plan. They put a request in with the DeKalb County Jail to interview Hernandez. And while they wait for the request to come through, their focus shifts back to Forest Park High and to Candice's friends, like Myleik.
I didn't do anything wrong. Y'all looking in the wrong place. I love this girl.
But after doing a thorough investigation, the detectives don't find anything incriminating, and Myleik is removed as a person of interest.
I never took offense to it because I know what she meant to me, so I never took offense to it.
It's all I ever wanted. How could I run from you if all I ever wanted was you?
In August 2011, 16 months after Candice's disappearance, detectives receive authorization to speak with convicted murderer Artemio Hernandez.
Hernandez is one of the guys that if he did something, he would tell you. We made arrangements to speak with him in the DeKalb County jail.
2320, you have visit 23.
This is the big time, hey, I'm gonna crack this thing wide open. I get there and we sit down and we build a rapport with him. He wants to talk to us. I laid it out, like this is what we got. Did you kill this girl? I showed Hernandez pictures of Candice. And he looked at the pictures and he said, I'd never seen her before. He said, I didn't do it. I did the other ones. I didn't do that one. That took the wind out my sails. The guy who we just knew was the killer said, it wasn't me, and I got nothing to say that he was. In the back of our minds, we still kept his name in there, but at this point in time, we didn't have any proof that he was related to the case.
More time goes by, no leads. But then, investigators identify another person of interest. There's another guy who's done bad things.
And looking at suspects, one person came into the immediate radar.
A young guy named Trey Jenkins. Before Candice went missing, detectives learned that Trey brought two young girls, one 17, one 18, to his house and raped them. And police find that this same guy has a connection to Candice Parchment.
We did some interviews and we did some background on him, and we determined that somehow or another Candice knew this guy. They had some communications and he had been arrested for some sexual assault related crimes.
There's a possibility investigators can't ignore. Did Trey assault Candice? Did he escalate from rape to murder?
He's suspect number one at this point in time. So we looked at him, attempts at interviews. We had to make arrangements to communicate with this individual.
But can detectives place Trey at the scene of the crime? It's a lot of work. Phone calls, endless files, pounding the pavement. And after all that,
ultimately, we determined that he was not in the area the whole time she was missing. He likely had some words with her, but was not the person who she met in the woods that night or took her to the woods that night. So he was eliminated. So now with Candice's case, I'm back to square one. It's not looking good. It stinks because I got nothing.
You should be treated like royalty.
it's been almost a year since they found Candice. There's only a couple of months left in 2011. Detectives are frustrated. They still got a whole lot of nothing. And Candice's loved ones? Maybe they'll never get answers. How do you make peace with something if you don't even know what happened? If Candice was still with us in 2011, she probably would have wanted to see the new Harry Potter movie. She would have been dancing to Rihanna's new album. Instead, she's a memory. A memory of joy for some, pain for others, and a haunting figure for investigators.
Hard to break a habit when it's hard to break a heart.
They work hard to find any leads. And then one day, our detective gets a call that changes everything.
On October 18, 2011, I get a frantic phone call as I'm leaving the police station for the day. It's Candice's mom. And she's like, Detective Melvin, I found something. And I have to calm her down, like, slow down, tell me what you found. She said, I found Candice's diary. I have to give it to you. So Candice's mom comes to the police department. Months and months and months of dead ends have come to this. Like, it's all or nothing. And I crack it open. And I start reading.
There's one entry, one dark secret that catches Detective Melvin's attention.
This is from Candice's diary, dated January 5th, 2010. She titled it A Frightening Experience. I snuck out of the house to go meet with two friends. Both were guys.
I went walking down the road. It was dark.
There's an abandoned house where one of my schoolmates used to live. Jermaine and Marche set me up to go to the house.
So at that moment, I wasn't thinking.
In the house, it was dark. Only light I had was my phone light.
Jermaine hit me with a rake in the head.
At first, I thought it was an accident. It wasn't.
Marche was blocking the door, so I couldn't get out. I tried to make up excuses, but they didn't care. Jermaine grabbed me and choked me. I was struggling for air. Please let me go, I said. I tried to get away. My pants unzipped. Really, I was scared.
The boys, you know who, tried to take my phone. I put up a fight. They couldn't get it. A few minutes later, we seen a car light in front of the abandoned house.
I was so excited, yet scared. They let me go. They panicked and begged me not to tell. Well, diary, this night has scared me to death.
Now's the time to stand and fight through all the pain and misery. We will stand tall when the rain falls.
See a lot going through your mind.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. Yeah, it's the first time I read that. I didn't know the details of all this. It's a sad situation right here.
Now's the time to
Two names, Marche and Jermaine. But who are they? The investigators know whose door to knock on.
They asked me about Marche. Me and Marche, we probably met in 2008. The thing that brought us together was music. He liked to produce music and make instrumentals and beats. and I like to sing and rap. So naturally we came together. This is so when I trusted, my mind was going a million miles an hour.
I went to our jail system on a hunch. Type in Marche. And I found a name, Marche Hickman. He's in jail for burglary. He'd been there for several months, but during the time that Candice disappeared, he was free. He was roaming around. And he lives on Sylvia Drive, right in the area where we found Candice's body.
So Marche actually went to Forest Park High with Candice, and Jermaine ran in his circle of friends. For authorities, this arouses some troubling suspicions.
My name is Bill Dixon. I was the Deputy Chief Assistant District Attorney in Clayton County. If she began talking about the rape at school, the motive for killing Candice could be shut her up.
But that's just a theory. Investigators need to know for sure if the assault Candice wrote about in her diary is actually connected to her murder. Luckily, they have access to the one person who'd know. Marche Hickman is currently locked up.
I was able to arrange for Marche to come and talk to me. We did question Marche about the sexual assault and what we found in Candice's diary. Tell me when the last time you saw Candice. Oh, well, I was playing basketball in the cul-de-sac at 415 Sylvia Drive, where she was last seen alive. And she was walking home. There was this guy following her. Marche tells me is a Hispanic guy. It was dark. He was creepy looking. Then she went in the woods and I guess she went home. So while you were there and you watched this guy follow her into the woods, did you hear anything? Did you see anything? No, I didn't hear or see anything.
It's a description that gives investigators pause. That description loosely fits another suspect, someone they spoke to before. Artemio Hernandez, a known killer. He denied everything. But people lie every day. The question is Marche telling the truth? There's only one way to find out. In his interrogation, Marche Hickman claims that a man was following Candice into the woods the day she disappeared. Investigators still have Artemio Hernandez on their radar. Was he the man Marche saw?
I challenged Marche. I said, well, if this person is following her, why didn't you walk her in the woods, walk her home? Well, she said she was fine. She said she had pepper spray. Marche is trying to play the dancing game with me about when he saw Candice.
But even though he's cast some doubt, after the interrogation, Marche moves to the top of the suspect list.
Marche lives in the area. He's less than a few feet from where the body was found. He has a history with Candice, and he is mentioned by Candice as a person who tried to sexually assault her.
But police need another piece of the puzzle. They need Jermaine.
We're making arrangements to get Jermaine to the police department, and we're gonna talk to both of them at the same time. When we talk to Jermaine, we tell him, Marche's in a room next door. First thing that comes out of Jermaine's mouth was, Man, Marche killed that girl. How you know he killed her? Because, man, Marche is crazy. I was scared of Marche. And then I asked him about the sexual assault. And, of course, Jermaine put the blame squarely on Marche. It was all Marche's idea.
And according to Jermaine, it all had to do with the assault, with exactly what Candice wrote in her diary.
One day, after the sexual assault, Marche started freaking out, thinking that Candice was gonna tell people. Jermaine told us Marche typed on his phone, "Hey, we should go kill Candice."
They were just neighborhood kids, Marche and Jermaine, from the apartments. Just through the cut. Seemed harmless. Until now. Police have Jermaine's side of the story, but what they really need is a confession from Marche, or it's all just hearsay.
So I tell Marche, we found her body, and we found some DNA on her body. And when you were locked up, they got your DNA. You remember that?
We can actually make him think that we already have his DNA.
Marche thinks we found his DNA on Candice's body. Then he started talking.
That's when the truth comes out. The tragedy.
Candice was walking home. Marche started to admit that he followed Candice into the woods as she was walking through the cut. And that he, I put my arm around her like this, and I was just holding her and hugging her.
We have him act out where he's putting his arm around her neck and actually, lifting her feet completely off the ground.
And at some point in time, Candice fell limp.
We asked, can you say 100% certain that you are the one that hurt Candice in that cut? And he admitted yes. And he also told me that he's 100% sure that he is the only one that did this.
Marche went back several times throughout the course of months, checking on Candice's body to ensure that it was still there and that no one had found it.
Even with the confession, Detective Melvin wants to do one more thing to help bring some peace to Candice's mother.
We talked to Marche and I said, hey, do you want the whole world to see you as an uncaring monster, or do you want to show people that you really genuinely feel bad about the things that you did? So he writes a letter.
Dear Mrs. Parchment, I'm sorry for what I have done. I ask for you for forgiveness. I feel so bad for this tragic accident. I was in the wrong state of mind. I know that you miss her, and I wish I can give her back to you. Please forgive me. I'm glad this is off my chest. Candice is forever missed. This guy can't be serious. Man, me, yeah, can you forgive me? It's not about you. This man, that's ridiculous right here, man. The sick, twisted individual.
Even having confessed, this isn't over.
On July 11th of 2012, Marche Hickman is indicted for the murder of Candice Parchment.
When the case first started, police had skeletal remains and some clothing. What we had going into the trial was a world of difference. We had Candice's diary. The diary was huge.
And when Candice's diary is read in court, members of the press can finally see how important this case really is.
I was a reporter for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. When the diary entry was read, it was hush in the courtroom.
You got something to hide. Secrets behind.
I tried to get away. My pants unzipped. Really, I was scared.
Danger follows behind.
Candice's words, crying out from the dark from so many months before, finding justice for herself and for her death.
Marche was blocking the door, so I couldn't get out.
I've been in a lot of courtrooms, and that was a moment that it kind of sent a chill up my bones.
I see trouble.
Jermaine grabbed me and choked me. I was struggling for air.
People who weren't following this, I think after this, did pay more attention.
Well, diary, this night has scared me to death.
We, the jury, find the defendant guilty of count 1, malice murder.
The mother of a murdered teenager says her daughter's own words helped convict her killer. A jury found Marche Hickman guilty of several charges, including murder and attempted rape of 15-year-old Candice Parchment.
Their diary pinpointed the truth and landed the right perpetrators in jail.
Marche is sentenced to life in prison without parole plus 20 years. Jermaine Robinson, who was a cooperating witness, pleads guilty to the attempted rape of Candice and is sentenced to 10 years.
This is a story of a 15-year-old girl and her diary.
Candice solved her own murder from beyond the grave.
It would have just been another cold case had it not been for the resilience and for the brilliance of our dear friend Candice Parchment.
I got to go to see her mother again. And I got to tell her that I kept my promise, that I found out who killed her daughter.
This is a story about how we see the world and what we choose not to see to make our own lives easier.
And it took some time just to realize.
When it was first notified to us that she was missing, no one took it serious. She just ran away from home. You know, it's just so unfortunate that so many stories like Candice stories happens daily and it doesn't get the recognition that it deserves.
But mostly, this is a story about a girl that lived in a place you've probably never heard of. A clever girl with bright eyes and a big smile. It's about why we should all know her name. It's a story about how Candice Parchment caught her killer.
Running out of time, running through my mind, I keep running.
The South Pacific is frequently painted in the collective imagination as a haven of absolute tranquility, a sprawling expanse of azure waters and lush, isolated islands where time seems to slow down and the harsh realities of the modern world fade away. Within this vast ocean lies American Samoa, a territory characterized not only by its breathtaking volcanic landscapes, but also by a deeply rooted, ancient traditional culture. At the very heart of this complex society is the village of Iliili. To understand the village of Iliili is to understand a community where the modern concept of isolation is practically non-existent. Houses sit close together, lives intersect daily, and the boundaries between individual households are constantly blurred by the overarching presence of the community. In a place like this, everyone knows everyone. The village is not just a geographical location on a map. It is a living, breathing organism where every joy is shared and, theoretically, every sorrow is noticed. Yet, it was within the borders of this very village that one of the most profound and devastating tragedies in the region's history unfolded in complete, deafening silence. To truly grasp the magnitude of the horror that occurred in Iliili, one must first understand the fundamental pillar of Samoan culture, the Aga. The Aga translates loosely to the extended family, but the English translation does a severe disservice to the true depth and weight of the word. Aga is the absolute core of social, political, and economic life in American Samoa. It represents an unbreakable bond of mutual respect, shared resources, and, most importantly, collective protection. In this traditional cultural framework, children are not just the sole responsibility of their biological parents. They are the sacred trust of the entire Aga and the broader village community. To raise a child is a communal duty, and to protect a child is an unquestionable moral imperative. The village is supposed to be an impenetrable fortress of safety for its youngest and most vulnerable members. Therefore, what happened to a nameless child in Iliili was not merely a brutal crime against an individual. It was a catastrophic betrayal of the deepest, most revered values of the Samoan people. It was an act that shattered the very foundation of the Aga, turning what should have been a sanctuary into a place of unspeakable, relentless torment. The individuals responsible for this torment were not strangers lurking in the shadows of the village. They were not outsiders who infiltrated the tight-knit community to do harm. They were the very people entrusted by nature and society to provide love, nourishment, and protection. They were the child's guardians, the parents, the ones whose fundamental biological and moral duty was to keep the darkness at bay. The realization that the architects of this child's suffering were the caregivers themselves sends a profound chill through the core of any compassionate human being. When the hands meant to soothe become the primary instruments of torture, and when the voices meant to comfort become the relentless sounds of terror, the psychological and physical devastation inflicted upon a child is absolute. This specific case forces us to look directly into the darkest corners of human nature, challenging our deepest assumptions about innate parental instinct and the supposed safety of the family home. Perhaps the most haunting element of the tragedy in Iliili is the profound silence that surrounded it. A child was subjected to systematic, prolonged abuse within a village where the close proximity of neighbors makes secrecy almost impossible. Walls in such communities are thin, both literally and metaphorically. People hear the cries in the night. They notice the sudden absences from daily village life. They see the strange shadows moving behind drawn curtains. Yet an overwhelming, suffocating silence blanketed this abuse for an unimaginable length of time. This was not a momentary lapse of judgment or a single, fatal strike in the heat of sudden anger. This was a sustained, calculated campaign of cruelty that stretched on for an excruciatingly long period. The question that continues to haunt the village of Iliili and the broader territory of American Samoa is how such profound suffering could exist in plain sight without a single person intervening. The failure was not just familial, it was deeply societal. The safety net, woven from the supposedly strong threads of the Aga and community vigilance, unraveled completely, leaving a highly vulnerable child to face a waking nightmare entirely alone. The heavy veil of secrecy was finally, irrevocably shattered when the child was brought through the emergency doors of the Lyndon B. Johnson Tropical Medical Center. Hospitals are universally recognized as sanctuaries of healing, places accustomed to dealing with the fragility and vulnerability of the human body. The medical professionals at LBJ are highly trained to handle severe emergencies, tragic accidents, and sudden, life-threatening illnesses. They are intimately familiar with pain and suffering in many forms. However, absolutely nothing in their extensive medical training or years of clinical experience could have prepared them for the sight that awaited them in the trauma room on that fateful day. When the attending doctors and nurses laid eyes on the young patient, the atmosphere in the room immediately shifted from frantic, professional urgency to a heavy, paralyzed shock. The medical staff, seasoned veterans of physical trauma, found themselves staring at a grim reality so deeply disturbing that it defied basic medical logic and fundamental human decency. The child's frail body was later described in official medical and investigative reports using a haunting phrase, a literal map of pain. This specific description perfectly encapsulates the sheer scale and chronological depth of the physical abuse the victim had endured. The injuries were not localized to one specific area. They told a horrifying story of whole-body suffering. As the emergency medical team carefully began their physical examination, they discovered a terrifying archaeological dig of trauma. There were fresh, open wounds still seeping and raw, speaking of recent, violent encounters that had occurred just hours or days prior. But beneath and immediately surrounding these fresh injuries were the distinct, unmistakable scars of the past. The doctors found older, partially healed lacerations and deep contusions that overlaid one another in a chaotic, tragic mosaic on the child's skin. This overlapping of old and new wounds was the most damning physical evidence of all. It proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that the violence was not a tragic, isolated accident or a singular loss of control. It was a strict routine. It was a systemic, calculated cycle of physical destruction that had become the defining feature of this child's short, agonizing life. The thorough physical examination revealed even darker, more sinister truths about the methods of the abusers. The patterns of the deep bruising and the specific nature of the lacerations indicated that the child had not merely been subjected to the anger of bare hands. The trauma was intentionally inflicted with significant force, utilizing heavy, hard objects. The presence of deep, bone-bruising contusions pointed toward a level of aggressive violence that crossed the line from abusive discipline into outright, methodical trautan. Furthermore, the medical staff discovered clear radiological evidence of older, completely untreated fractures. Bones that had been violently broken by severe blunt force trauma had been left to heal on their own, likely causing excruciating, prolonged agony without any medical intervention, stabilization, or pain relief. Every untreated, improperly healed fracture was a silent, internal scream, a permanent physical testament to the isolation and absolute powerlessness of the victim. The guardians had not only inflicted the devastating injuries, but had deliberately and maliciously withheld the basic medical care that could have eased the suffering, ensuring that the child's entire world remained one of constant, unmitigated pain. As if the brutal physical beatings with hard objects were not enough, the detailed medical reports highlighted another, equally insidious form of abuse that had been utilized by the caregivers: severe, prolonged starvation. When the child finally arrived at the Lyndon B. Johnson Medical Center, they were in an incredibly advanced state of clinical malnutrition. This was not a tragic case of unavoidable poverty or an unintentional inability to provide adequate food. In the broader context of the subsequent criminal investigation, it became horrifyingly clear that the deprivation of sustenance was intentionally weaponized against the victim. Food, the most basic, fundamental necessity for human life and physical growth, was cruelly withheld as a strict method of punishment and absolute control. The prolonged starvation ravaged the child's internal physiological systems, aggressively stripping away essential muscle and fat, leaving the body unimaginably frail and defenseless. This severe malnutrition had a catastrophic secondary medical effect. It completely and utterly decimated the child's immune system. When the fresh, bleeding wounds inevitably became infected in the unsanitary environment. The severely weakened body had absolutely no biological reserves left to fight off the invading bacteria. The starvation ensured that even if the physical blows did not immediately cause death, the resulting infections would find zero physical resistance. The combination of brutal, repeated physical trauma, the agonizing, relentless pain of untreated fractures, and the debilitating, systemic weakness of severe starvation created an inescapable trap of mortality for the young victim. Despite the desperate, frantic, and highly skilled efforts of the medical staff at the Lyndon B. Johnson Medical Center, the sheer volume of damage inflicted upon the small, fragile body was simply too extensive, too deeply entrenched in the child's failing systems. The child, having miraculously endured a lifetime of concentrated suffering that most adults could not possibly fathom, eventually succumbed to the overwhelming, multi-system trauma. The heartbreaking death of this child was the inevitable culmination of months, perhaps years, of unchecked, escalating brutality. The medical monitors finally flatlined, and a heavy, devastating finality settled over the Stark hospital room. But the child's passing was not the end of this dark story. It was merely the explosive catalyst that would soon tear the village of Iliili and the entire territory of American Samoa apart. The conclusive medical findings from the Lyndon B. Johnson Medical Center left absolutely no room for ambiguity or alternative explanations, and the wheels of the justice system began to turn with a furious, unprecedented momentum. The local authorities, confronted directly with the undeniable, gruesome physical evidence painstakingly documented by the medical examiners, moved swiftly and decisively to apprehend the caregivers responsible. The formal criminal charges brought against the guardians were the most severe available under the territory's law: first-degree murder and child abuse resulting in death. These specific charges accurately reflected the calculated, intentional, and highly prolonged nature of the abuse. This was not categorized as a tragic manslaughter or a crime of sudden passion. It was legally recognized as a deliberate, slow extinguishing of a human life through systematic torture and intentional deprivation. The legal proceedings that would soon follow promised to be a harrowing, deeply emotional journey through the darkest evidence imaginable, forcing an entire community to finally confront the monsters living quietly within its own borders. The profound societal shockwaves generated by the tragedy in Iliili forced a painful cultural reckoning across American Samoa. The horrifying reality that the traditional AGA structure had failed so spectacularly led to widespread public outrage and deep communal shame. It sparked an immediate, desperate demand for accountability, not just for the murderers, but for the silent neighbors who had looked the other way. This collective guilt birthed the urgent "See Something, Say Something" campaigns, fundamentally shifting the social responsibility of child protection. Furthermore, it forced local child protection agencies to drastically overhaul their procedures, implementing rigorous, uncompromising checks on high-risk families and desperately expanding the resources for emergency rescue hotlines. The Iliili case remains a permanent, bloody stain on the history of the Pacific region, frequently studied in criminal psychology as the ultimate, devastating example of systemic failure, proving that the deepest horrors often hide behind the closed doors of the most peaceful villages. To understand the depth of the tragedy that befell this young child, we must first immerse ourselves in the physical and cultural landscape of where their short life unfolded. American Samoa is a territory defined by its stunning volcanic peaks and the vast, isolating embrace of the Pacific Ocean. It is a place where nature is both overwhelmingly beautiful and profoundly dominant. Within this territory lies the village of Iliili, located on the main island of Tutuila. It is a community characterized by its lush surroundings, tropical humidity, and the pervasive sound of the ocean wind moving through the palm trees. Villages in this region are not mere collections of houses arranged along paved roads for convenience. They are deeply interconnected social ecosystems woven together by centuries of tradition, shared ancestry, and a collective understanding of survival in a remote island environment. The physical layout of Iliili reflects this interconnectedness. Homes are built in close proximity, often without the high fences or rigid boundaries that define suburban life in the Western world. Daily existence spills out from the interiors of houses onto wide porches, open yards, and shared communal spaces. People live their lives in the peripheral vision of their neighbors. It is an environment where privacy is scarce, and the rhythm of one household naturally bleeds into the rhythm of the next. In such a setting, the concept of a secret is fundamentally challenged by the sheer physical closeness of the community. Every sound, every movement, and every disruption in the daily pattern is typically registered by the collective consciousness of the village. This geographical and social intimacy makes the sustained isolation of one specific child within this vibrant, overlapping tapestry not just an anomaly, but a deliberate, meticulously orchestrated act of concealment. The social fabric holding Iliili together is governed by Fa Samoa, the traditional Samoan way of life. This is not merely a set of historical customs relegated to special ceremonies. It is a living, breathing framework that dictates everyday behavior, social hierarchies, and moral obligations. At the absolute epicenter of Fa Samoa is the concept of the Aga, the extended family unit. The Aga transcends the nuclear family model. It encompasses grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins, and distant relatives, all functioning under a unified structure of mutual support and shared responsibility. In this cultural paradigm, a child is never viewed as the exclusive property or sole burden of their biological parents or immediate legal guardians. Instead, every child is considered a precious asset of the entire Aga, a living continuation of the family lineage and a shared responsibility. The elders of the Aga are expected to impart wisdom and ensure the physical and spiritual well-being of the youth. In return, the youth are taught to show absolute, unquestioning respect to their elders. This reciprocal relationship forms a robust, multi-layered safety net. If a parent is struggling, the extended family is theoretically designed to step in automatically to provide resources, care, and guidance. The idea that a child could suffer severe, prolonged neglect or physical violence within the very heart of the Aga is utterly antithetical to the foundational principles of Samoan culture. It represents an unthinkable corruption of the system meant to guarantee their safety. Therefore, understanding the identity of this young victim requires acknowledging them not just as an individual, but as a deeply embedded member of this cultural structure. They were born into a system that had protected generations of children before them, a system renowned for its communal warmth and fierce devotion to kinship. Yet, despite being physically located in the center of this traditionally hypervigilant and highly communal society, the young victim became profoundly invisible. Because the authorities and medical professionals meticulously protected the child's identity following their tragic death, we are left to construct a portrait of their existence through the harrowing lens of the medical examiner's report. The physical evidence tells the story of a child whose universe had been violently and systematically shrunk down to the dimensions of a single, suffocating space. While other children in Iliili were running freely through the village pathways, attending community gatherings, and playing under the broad, watchful eyes of the neighborhood, this child was experiencing a completely parallel, nightmarish reality. The child's daily existence was defined not by the nurturing rhythms of village life, but by the terrifying unpredictability of their abusers. We must consider the psychological profoundness of this isolation. To be a child is to naturally seek connection, to look for faces that offer safety, and to explore the boundaries of the world. For this victim, those boundaries were rigidly enforced by fear and physical pain. The home, intended to be a sanctuary, was transformed into an impenetrable fortress of suffering. The guardians managed to create a terrifying vacuum right in the middle of a crowded village. They exploited the deep-seated cultural respect for family autonomy, weaponizing the privacy of their domestic sphere to ensure that the child's distress signals never breached the threshold of their front door. The victim was systematically erased from the social registry of the village long before their physical life was extinguished. Their absence from the communal eye was likely explained away by the abusers with casual excuses that went unchallenged by a community conditioned to respect the internal affairs of the Aga. The medical evidence of overlapping scars, deep bone bruises, and prolonged starvation provides a terrifying glimpse into the victim's internal psychological landscape. Children who endure this specific, systematic type of abuse do not merely suffer physical injuries, they undergo a complete psychological deconstruction. The victim in Ili Ili learned early on that the fundamental rules of human interaction were deeply corrupted. The very individuals who were biologically and socially mandated to provide nourishment and protection were the primary sources of agony and deprivation. This profound betrayal forces a child's mind into a constant, exhausting state of hypervigilance. Every footstep approaching their space, every shift in tone of voice, every sudden movement from their guardians would have been interpreted as a potential precursor to violence. The starvation adds an entirely different, incredibly cruel dimension to their psychological profile. Hunger is a primal, all-consuming drive. When food is intentionally withheld as a weapon of control, it reduces the victim's existence to a desperate, singular focus on survival. The child's days would have been consumed by the gnawing, physical pain of an empty stomach, a biological alarm bell ringing constantly without any hope of relief. This systemic deprivation saps not only the body's physical energy, but also the mind's cognitive capacity to process trauma. As the months of abuse and starvation dragged on, the child likely transitioned from a state of active fear and crying out for help to a profound, silent state of learned helplessness. They would have realized, with devastating clarity, that their cries brought no rescue, only the potential for further retribution. The overlapping scars on their frail body were physical records of this agonizing realization. They documented a timeline of repeated trauma where the child was forced to endure excruciating pain in complete and utter silence, knowing that no one was coming to save them. The sheer duration of this abuse paints a chilling portrait of endurance. This was a young soul trapped in a physical vessel that was slowly, methodically being dismantled. They endured the agonizing, untreated healing of broken bones without a single dose of pain medication, a process that requires a heartbreaking level of silent resilience. They endured the stinging infection of open wounds in a tropical climate, their weakened immune system fighting a losing battle while their abusers remained completely indifferent to their physical decline. The psychological resilience required simply to wake up each day in that environment is almost incomprehensible. Yet, perhaps the most tragic aspect of the victim's profile is the absolute dissonance between their internal reality and the external world just beyond their walls. Just a few feet away from where this child was being systematically starved and beaten, the normal, vibrant life of Ili Ili continued uninterrupted. Neighbors likely shared meals, families gathered for evening prayers, and the community celebrated its traditional milestones. The air outside was filled with the sounds of a society functioning exactly as it was designed to function, completely oblivious to the catastrophic failure occurring within its own ranks. The victim, weak, bruised, and starving, would have heard these sounds. They would have heard the laughter of other children, the casual conversations of adults, the distant, muffled noises of a world they were violently excluded from participating in. This auditory proximity to safety and normalcy must have been a form of psychological torture in itself, a constant reminder of the life they were being denied. They were dying in the middle of a crowd, surrounded by a culturally mandated safety net that had, through a fatal combination of deception by the abusers and lack of vigilance from the community, completely failed to catch them. The portrait of this child is ultimately one of profound, unspeakable loneliness, an isolated island of suffering floating silently in a sea of communal life. The progression of a crime like the one that occurred in the village of Ili Ili is rarely defined by a single, explosive moment of anger. In the realm of true crime analysis, we often look for a definitive timeline, a specific evening or a precise hour when a boundary was crossed and an act of violence became a criminal tragedy. However, when examining the reality of what took place within the walls of that family home, the incident must be understood as a continuous, slowly unfolding narrative of cruelty that occupied every second of the victim's life. The incident was not an interruption of the daily routine, it was the daily routine itself. It was a systematic reality where the basic structures of caregiving were entirely inverted, replaced by an ongoing campaign of physical and psychological subjugation. For this nameless child, the passage of time was not marked by the changing of seasons, school days, or village festivals, but by the alternating cycles of anticipation, endurance, and the brief, fragile quiet that occupied the spaces between physical assaults. The systematic nature of this environment meant that the escalation of violence was almost imperceptible to the outside world, as it grew organically behind closed doors, feeding on the absolute vulnerability of a child who had no means of escape and no voice to carry their plight beyond the threshold of the house. The physical mechanics of this sustained campaign of abuse were revealed in horrifying detail through the medical findings at the Lyndon B. Johnson Medical Center, establishing a clear picture of intentional, methodical torture. The trauma documented on the victim's body was characterized by the deliberate use of hard objects, an element that demonstrates a premeditated choice to inflict severe pain and physical degradation. When a hard object is repeatedly used as an instrument of violence against the fragile frame of a growing child, the physiological impact is devastating and far-reaching. The force of these impacts penetrated deep into the soft tissue, rupturing blood vessels and crushing muscle layers, which resulted in deep, extensive contusions across multiple areas of the body. These were not minor injuries that could be attributed to typical childhood play or accidental falls. They were deep, agonizing reservoirs of internal bleeding that required significant physical force to produce. The widespread distribution of these deep bruises indicates that the attacks were indiscriminate, targeting the child's limbs, torso, and back with equal ferocity, ensuring that no part of their body was left untouched by the violence of their caregivers. In addition to the extensive soft tissue damage, the skeletal system of the young victim bore the permanent, internal scars of the ongoing incident, providing an undeniable record of historical trauma. The clinical examination and radiological imaging performed by the medical staff revealed the presence of older, completely untreated fractures. A bone fracture is a catastrophic physical event for a child, causing immediate, excruciating pain and requiring swift medical intervention to properly align and stabilize the bone for healing. In this instance, the guardians consciously chose to withhold all medical care when these fractures occurred, forcing the child to navigate their daily existence with broken bones. Without medical stabilization, every movement, every shift in weight, and every breath would have caused the jagged edges of the fractured bones to shift against internal tissues, creating a continuous cycle of raw, unmitigated agony. Over time, the child's body attempted to mend these injuries on its own, resulting in bones that healed in distorted, unnatural positions. These improperly healed fractures stood as silent, internal monuments to past crises, proving that the violence was a long-standing pattern that had been inflicted and ignored months before the final fatal encounter. Running parallel to the brutal physical beatings with hard objects was an equally destructive mechanism of torture, a systematic and prolonged regime of starvation. In the study of severe domestic abuse, the weaponization of food is recognized as an extreme method of psychological and physical control, designed to reduce the victim to a state of absolute dependency and physical weakness. In the Ili Ili case, starvation was not the result of poverty or an inability to access resources, but was deliberately employed by the guardians as a primary form of punishment. The physiological consequences of prolonged starvation are catastrophic, particularly for a developing child whose body requires a constant influx of nutrients to support cellular growth and metabolic function. When these nutrients are withheld, the body enters a catabolic state, systematically destroying its own tissues to keep vital organs functioning. The child's body was forced to consume its own fat reserves and muscle mass, leading to an advanced state of emaciation and severe clinical malnutrition. This profound wasting of the body's physical structure removed the natural layers of tissue that might have offered some protection against the blunt force trauma, ensuring that every subsequent blow from a hard object struck directly against exposed bone and fragile internal systems. The most insidious and ultimately fatal outcome of this prolonged starvation was the total destruction of the child's immune system. The human body requires significant nutritional energy to produce white blood cells, antibodies, and the complex proteins necessary to defend against biological pathogens. As the malnutrition advanced to a critical stage, the victims' immune reserves were entirely depleted, leaving them in a state of profound immunodeficiency. This biological collapse meant that when the physical beatings resulted in open wounds, deep lacerations, and abrasions, the child's body was completely incapable of mounting a defense against infection. In the humid, tropical environment of American Samoa, open injuries that are left uncleaned and exposed to unsanitary conditions rapidly become colonized by bacteria. Because the guardians deliberately neglected the child's basic hygiene and medical needs, these wounds quickly became infected. The bacteria encountered absolutely no resistance from the child's hollowed-out immune system, allowing the infection to transition swiftly from a localized issue into a rampant, systemic threat that spread deep into the surrounding tissues and began to poison the bloodstream. The true chronological depth of this horror was visibly written upon the child's skin through the presence of overlapping old and new wounds, a physical manifestation of the relentless frequency of the abuse. When the medical team examined the young patient, they did not find a single set of uniform injuries, but rather a complex, multi-layered timeline of trauma. Fresh, actively bleeding lacerations and acute, immediate swelling were found situated directly on top of older, fading contusions and rigid scar tissue from previous assaults. This structural layering of injuries provides irrefutable evidence that the incident was an inescapable loop of violence. The child was never granted the time or the peace required for the physical body to heal. Before a bruise could resolve or an open wound could form a protective layer of new skin, a subsequent assault would be unleashed on the exact same location, reopening old injuries and compounding the trauma. The child's body was a living archive of their suffering, where the physical markers of past violence were constantly overwritten by the violence of the present, ensuring that they existed in a permanent state of raw, unmitigated physical pain from which there was never a moment of respite. As the weeks of physical trauma, starvation, and medical neglect converged, the incident entered its final, irreversible phase within the walls of the Ili home. The unchecked infections within the child's open wounds broke through the last remaining biological barriers and flooded the circulatory system, leading to widespread systemic infection. This condition triggers a massive, catastrophic inflammatory response throughout the entire body, causing widespread damage to healthy tissues and forcing vital organs to work under extreme stress. For a healthy individual, this is a critical medical emergency requiring immediate intensive care. For a child whose body had been systematically dismantled by months of starvation and broken by repeated blunt force trauma, it was a physiological breaking point. The toxic load of the rampant infection, combined with the absolute lack of nutritional energy reserves, caused the child's internal organs to enter a state of progressive failure. The heart struggled to pump blood through a failing circulatory system, the kidneys could no longer process metabolic waste, and the respiratory system began to falter under the immense weight of systemic shock. The child was actively dying inside the home, their life slowly slipping away as their body succumbed to the overwhelming multi-system trauma. It was only at this absolute threshold of mortality, when the child was entirely unresponsive and the physical signs of their impending death could no longer be hidden or denied, that the guardians finally broke their pattern of isolation and transported the victim to the Lyndon B. Johnson Medical Center. This decision was not motivated by a sudden return of parental empathy, but by the stark, terrifying realization that the physical evidence of their cruelty was about to culminate in a permanent fatality that could no longer be concealed within the domestic sphere. The arrival of the child at the medical center marked the precise moment the hidden incident was violently thrust into the public domain. When the emaciated, bruised, and unresponsive form of the child was carried through the emergency room doors, the heavy veil of secrecy that had protected the abusers within the village of Ili was completely shattered. The medical professionals who received the patient were immediately struck by a profound sense of shock and horror, recognizing instantly that they were not dealing with a standard medical emergency, but with the catastrophic aftermath of a prolonged, systematic campaign of human torture. The trauma room of the Lyndon B. Johnson Medical Center became the scene of a frantic, desperate effort to save a life that had been systematically hollowed out by months of abuse. The attending doctors and nurses initiated aggressive emergency protocols, administering intravenous fluids, high-dose antibiotics, and respiratory support in a frantic bid to stabilize the child's collapsing vital signs. However, the medical team was fighting against an accumulation of physical destruction that was simply too vast to overcome. The combination of advanced clinical malnutrition, multiple untreated bone fractures, deep tissue contusions, and rampant systemic infection had compromised the structural and functional integrity of the child's vital organs beyond the point of medical repair. The body simply had no biological reserves left to respond to the treatments or to sustain life. After a heartbreaking struggle against the inevitable, the monitors flatlined and the child succumbed to multi-system trauma. The death of the child brought a merciful end to an existence defined by unimaginable pain, but it simultaneously served as the catalyst for a major criminal investigation, leaving behind a body that stood as an unassailable piece of forensic evidence that would soon force the entire community to answer for the tragedy that had unfolded in their midst. The hospital room, once filled with the chaotic sounds of emergency procedures, fell into a heavy, absolute quiet that symbolized the end of the victim's physical journey. This quiet, however, was quickly replaced by the arrival of law enforcement officials who realized that the medical chart before them was actually the opening dossier of a homicide case. The physical evidence left on the child's body was so definitive that it completely eliminated any possibility of defense or denial by the caregivers, setting into motion an immediate forensic audit of the home in Ely and initiating the formal legal process that would hold the perpetrators legally responsible for the systematic destruction of a young life. The moment the pulse of the young victim ceased within the walls of the Lyndon B. Johnson Medical Center, the nature of the crisis shifted from a desperate medical rescue to an intensive, high-stakes criminal investigation. In the architecture of true crime investigations, the transition between the medical world and the legal world is governed by strict protocols designed to preserve evidence that cannot speak for itself. The medical professionals who had fought to sustain the child's life immediately became the initial witnesses for law enforcement, transitioning from caregivers to forensic observers. The hospital room was secured, and the local police department was formally mobilized, recognizing that the body of the child was now the single most critical piece of forensic evidence in a potential homicide case. The initial step of the investigation did not begin with interrogations or community canvassing, but with a silent, meticulous examination of the medical chart. This documentation served as the foundation of the entire case, a clinical ledger that translated physical trauma into a legally binding record of systematic violence. The step-by-step investigation began with a formal request for a comprehensive forensic autopsy, a procedure that allows medical examiners to look beneath the surface of the skin to understand the true extent and cause of mortality. For the detectives assigned to the case, the physical body of the child presented an overwhelming challenge due to the sheer density of the injuries. The investigators, working alongside forensic pathologists at the Lyndon B. Johnson Medical Center, began the painstaking process of mapping every single mark, scar, and laceration on the victim's frame. This mapping process requires extreme precision, as each injury must be measured, photographed, and categorized by its age and characteristics. The investigators immediately noted that they were not looking at a collection of injuries from a singular event, but rather a historical archive of abuse. The documentation of this physical map was the first critical step in dismantling any potential defense that the Guardians might offer, providing an unassailable visual and structural timeline of the violence that had occurred behind the closed doors of the Ely residence. The true breakthrough and central turning point in the investigation came when the forensic team analyzed the chronological relationship between the various wounds. This analysis revealed the definitive pattern of overlapping old and new injuries, which served as the most significant piece of evidence in establishing the systemic nature of the crime. In forensic science, the age of a wound can be determined by its stage of healing, the presence of scar tissue, and the cellular changes occurring within the skin layers. The investigators documented fresh, acute lacerations that were still actively seeping fluid, indicating they had been inflicted immediately prior to the child's admission to the hospital. Directly beneath these active wounds, however, lay dense layers of rigid scar tissue and deep, fading contusions from older assaults. This overlapping pattern provided the investigators with a profound realization. The abuse was continuous, rhythmic, and entirely inescapable. It proved that the child was trapped in a perpetual cycle where new trauma was constantly being superimposed onto injuries that had never been given the opportunity to heal, completely invalidating any claims that the child's condition was the result of a sudden accident or an isolated incident. As the physical mapping progressed, the investigation moved deeper into the skeletal structure of the child through the utilization of advanced radiological imaging. This step of the investigation provided the definitive evidence of what the medical reports characterized as a sustained campaign of physical torture. The X-rays and internal scans revealed a terrifying history of multiple bone fractures located throughout the child's body. What made these findings particularly damning for the investigators was the clear evidence that these fractures were completely untreated. In a standard household, a broken bone triggers an immediate medical response, resulting in stabilization, casting, and pain management. The radiological evidence demonstrated that the child's bones had been broken by severe blunt force and then left to mend on their own in the unsanitary and hostile environment of the home. The investigators observed that the bones had formed irregular, distorted calluses as the body desperately tried to heal itself without medical alignment. This piece of forensic evidence established a clear timeline of long-term medical neglect and extreme physical cruelty, proving that the guardians had consciously chosen to leave the child in a state of prolonged, excruciating agony over a period of many months. The investigation then turned its focus toward the underlying cause of the child's profound emaciation, examining the biological evidence of prolonged starvation. The detectives and forensic specialists analyzed blood chemistry reports and metabolic markers provided by the laboratory at the Lyndon B. Johnson Medical Center. This aspect of the investigation was crucial because it established that the child's severe malnutrition was not an accidental byproduct of illness, but a deliberate weaponization of sustenance by the caregivers. The laboratory findings showed a complete depletion of essential proteins, vitamins, and fat reserves, indicating that food had been systematically withheld as a primary method of punishment and absolute subjugation. The investigators documented how this prolonged starvation had caused the child's body to enter a terminal catabolic state, systematically breaking down its own muscular structure to maintain basic survival. This evidence of deliberate starvation added a profound layer of intent to the criminal case, showing that the guardians were executing a multifaceted campaign to destroy the child both through active physical violence and intentional physical deprivation. A critical component of this step-by-step investigation involved tracing the biological pathway that led directly to the child's death, connecting the physical abuse to the final multi-system failure. The forensic examiners determined that the advanced state of starvation had completely obliterated the child's immune system, rendering them entirely defenseless against bacterial pathogens. The investigators documented that the open wounds and deep lacerations inflicted by the hard objects had become heavily infected due to the absolute lack of hygiene and medical care within the home. Because the child's immune system had been dismantled by the prolonged lack of nutrition, the bacteria were able to breach the bloodstream without encountering any biological resistance. This resulted in a rapid, unchecked systemic infection that overwhelmed the child's vital organs, leading directly to the fatal multi-system trauma. By mapping this precise chain of causality, the investigators were able to prove that the starvation and the physical beatings were not separate issues, but were interconnected mechanisms that worked together to guarantee the tragic outcome, forming the legal basis for the highest criminal charges. With the comprehensive medical and forensic dossier compiled, the investigation expanded outward from the hospital room to the physical scene of the crime within the village of Ely Ely. Detectives executed a search of the residence where the child had been kept, seeking to reconcile the physical findings on the victim's body with the environment in which they had lived. This step of the investigation focused on identifying the specific instruments of trauma indicated by the medical reports. The forensic analysis of the child's deep bone bruises and lacerations had established that hard objects had been utilized to inflict the injuries. During the search of the home, Investigators meticulously documented the living conditions, looking for items that matched the specific geometry and impact patterns found on the victim's skin. The physical reality of the household revealed an environment of stark isolation, where the child had been kept hidden away from the normal, vibrant life of the surrounding community. The collection of physical evidence from the scene provided the final connective tissue of the case, linking the forensic findings from the autopsy directly to the specific domestic space controlled by the guardians. The final stage of the active investigation involved confronting the profound social paradox that defined this case: how such extreme, prolonged abuse could occur entirely unnoticed in a tight-knit village like Ely, where community life is deeply interconnected. Investigators conducted interviews with neighbors and extended family members, attempting to understand the wall of silence that had surrounded the child's suffering. The interview process revealed a deeply troubling pattern of social evasion and missed signals. Neighbors admitted to noticing the child's prolonged absences and hearing muffled, distressing sounds emanating from the residents, but these indicators were consistently ignored due to a cultural reluctance to interfere in the internal affairs of an autonomous family unit. The abusers had successfully manipulated this cultural boundary, using the traditional respect for the family sphere as a shield to hide their systematic cruelty. This phase of the investigation exposed a catastrophic failure of the communal safety net, proving that the silence of the surrounding environment had inadvertently provided the perpetrators with the absolute isolation necessary to carry out their campaign of torture without fear of intervention. The culmination of this step-by-step forensic and situational investigation resulted in the assembly of an unassailable criminal dossier by the local authorities. Every piece of data collected, from the overlapping layers of scars documented in the emergency room to the radiological evidence of untreated bone fractures, the laboratory proof of weaponized starvation, and the physical evidence recovered from the home, pointed to a singular, undeniable conclusion. The findings completely eliminated any possibility that the child's death was accidental, establishing instead a deliberate, prolonged, and highly coordinated campaign of homicide by torture. Armed with this definitive body of evidence, the prosecutors moved forward with a formal filing of the most severe charges available under the law: first-degree murder and child abuse resulting in death. The meticulous work of the investigators and medical professionals at the Lyndon B. Johnson Medical Center ensured that the perpetrators would face the full, unyielding weight of the justice system, transforming the silent suffering of the young victim into an undeniable, public demand for absolute legal accountability. The transition from the sterile, brightly lit environment of the Lyndon B. Johnson Medical Center to the solemn, wood-paneled confines of the territorial courthouse marked the beginning of a profound cultural and legal reckoning for American Samoa. The judicial process that followed was not merely a mechanical application of territorial law, but a deeply agonizing public dissection of a catastrophic societal failure. The courthouse itself, usually a place for resolving land disputes or minor infractions within the community, was suddenly transformed into a theater of profound tragedy. The atmosphere within the courtroom was suffocating, thick with an unprecedented mixture of communal grief, searing anger, and an overwhelming sense of cultural shame. Members of the community, those who had lived just steps away from the unfolding horror in Ely, crowded the gallery, their faces etched with a painful realization of their own proximity to the darkness. The defendants, the very guardians who had systematically dismantled the life of the child entrusted to their care, were brought before the bench not just as individuals accused of a crime, but as the living embodiments of a betrayal that struck at the absolute core of the Samoan identity. The physical space of the courtroom felt entirely inadequate to contain the sheer magnitude of the sorrow that the case had generated, setting the stage for a trial that would force an entire society to look directly into a mirror it desperately wished to avoid. The formal reading of the charges served as the initial, devastating blow in the legal proceedings, effectively shattering any lingering illusions that the child's death could have been the result of a tragic accident or a sudden, unforeseen illness. The prosecution, standing before the judge and the assembled community, clearly and methodically laid out the absolute most severe charges available within the Territorial Penal Code: first-degree murder and child abuse resulting in death. These legal terms, while clinical in their construction, carried a massive, undeniable weight in the silent courtroom. The charge of first-degree murder required the prosecution to prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that the death was not only intentional but heavily premeditated, a slow, deliberate extinguishing of a life rather than a momentary loss of control. The accompanying charge of child abuse resulting in death specifically addressed the prolonged, agonizing mechanics of the crime, highlighting the systematic nature of the starvation, the repeated blunt force trauma, and the deliberate withholding of critical medical care. Hearing these charges read aloud in a public forum stripped away the heavy veil of domestic privacy that the abusers had so effectively weaponized during the victim's life. The defendants were forced to stand and listen as the full, horrifying scope of their actions was officially recorded into the legal history of the territory, marking the definitive end of their ability to hide behind the traditional protections of the family structure. The prosecution's strategy throughout the trial was fundamentally anchored not in passionate rhetoric or dramatic emotional appeals, but in the cold, irrefutable reality of the forensic medical evidence. Because the young victim had been silenced permanently by the abuse, the state relied entirely on the child's broken body to serve as the primary witness against the guardians. The medical examiners and forensic experts from the medical center were called to the stand to translate the complex language of human anatomy and trauma into a clear, undeniable narrative of torture for the court. Step by agonizing step, the prosecution guided the experts through the documentation of the child's injuries, publicly presenting the literal map of pain that had defined the victim's existence. The presentation of the radiological evidence was particularly devastating, as the internal scans showing the multiple, untreated bone fractures were displayed for the court. A heavy, profound silence settled over the gallery. The prosecution meticulously explained how each distorted, improperly healed bone represented a distinct, prolonged period of excruciating agony where the child had been left to suffer without any medical intervention or basic human comfort. The prosecution then pivoted to the complex metabolic evidence that proved the deliberate weaponization of food. By presenting the severe depletion of the child's biological reserves and the total collapse of their immune system, the state successfully demonstrated that the starvation was an intentional, calculated mechanism of destruction. The experts meticulously detailed how the systematic deprivation of nutrients had stripped away the child's physical defenses, ensuring that the bodily trauma inflicted by the hard objects would inevitably lead to unchecked, fatal systemic infection. This clinical breakdown of the physiological consequences of starvation was crucial, as it completely eradicated any potential defense argument that the malnutrition was an accidental oversight or a result of socioeconomic hardship. The evidence explicitly proved that the guardians had orchestrated a slow, methodical starvation process designed to severely weaken the victim, transforming their home into a sealed chamber of deprivation. This phase of the trial was emotionally brutal for all in attendance, as it forced the community to confront the terrifying reality that the perpetrators had not simply struck the child in anger, but had actively and persistently plotted the child's physical deterioration over a period of many months. Faced with this overwhelming mountain of forensic data, the defense found itself navigating an absolute legal impossibility. In standard criminal trials, a defense strategy often relies on introducing reasonable doubt, questioning the timeline of events, or suggesting alternative explanations for the physical evidence. However, the sheer density and historical depth of the trauma documented on the victim's body rendered these standard defensive tactics completely useless. The defense attorneys could not argue that the overlapping layers of scar tissue were the result of a single, tragic fall, nor could they plausibly explain how multiple severe bone fractures had gone completely unnoticed in a small, shared domestic space. The profound emaciation of the child stood as an impenetrable barrier against any claim of parental care or benign neglect. The defendants were fundamentally trapped by the biological reality of the body they had destroyed. Their profound silence during the trial, their inability to offer any rational justification or mitigating explanation for the horrors inflicted within their home, only served to amplify the sheer monstrosity of their actions. The trial became less of an adversarial contest between two legal teams and more of an inevitable, unyielding march toward absolute legal accountability, driven entirely by the undeniable, echoing truth of the forensic autopsy. The psychological toll of the trial on the jury, the judge, and the broader community cannot be overstated. For the individuals tasked with rendering a verdict, the experience was an agonizing descent into an unfathomable darkness that directly contradicted their deepest cultural values. The jurors were not disconnected strangers. They were members of the same overarching societal structure, raised with the same ingrained reverence for the extended family and the fundamental duty to protect children. Being forced to examine the horrific photographs, to listen to the clinical descriptions of prolonged agony, and to digest the reality of the untreated fractures required them to endure a secondary trauma that would undoubtedly leave a permanent mark on their collective conscience. The trial shattered the comforting illusion that their traditional social structures were entirely immune to such severe corruption. It forced a painful, internal questioning among the spectators and the public regarding how the protective layers of the village community had been so thoroughly bypassed. The overwhelming evidence presented day after day stripped away any remaining deniability, leaving the community to grapple with the harsh reality that they had unknowingly coexisted with individuals capable of unimaginable cruelty. This collective psychological burden hung heavy over the proceedings, transforming the courtroom into a space of profound mourning not just for the lost child, but for the loss of communal innocence. The judge, presiding over this horrific case, faced a monumental task of articulating the community's grief and the territory's strict legal boundaries before delivering the final sentence. In the closing moments of the trial, the bench became the focal point for a society demanding retribution for an unforgivable sin. The judge carefully outlined the devastating timeline that the medical experts had painstakingly reconstructed, emphasizing that the most chilling aspect of the crime was not a sudden burst of rage, but the quiet, daily commitment to maintaining the child's suffering. The sentencing phase allowed the court to fully address the profound disparity between the vulnerability of the victim and the absolute power wielded by the abusers. The court noted that the perpetrators had utilized their position of authority not to nurture, but to systematically dismantle the life they were sworn to protect. The trial reached its definitive conclusion when the jury returned from their deliberations. After thoroughly reviewing the insurmountable cascade of medical evidence, the timeline of untreated injuries, and the undeniable proof of systemic starvation, the legal outcome was both swift and absolute. The guardians were found definitively guilty of all charges, most notably the charge of first-degree murder and the charge of child abuse resulting in death. The reading of the verdict was a moment of profound, heavy solemnity. There was no sense of triumph or victory in the courtroom, only a grim, necessary acknowledgement that the legal system had functioned as designed in the face of absolute horror. The guilty verdict served as an official, unyielding condemnation of the defendants' actions, ensuring that they would be permanently removed from the society they had so deeply betrayed. The sentencing that followed was severe, reflecting the calculated, prolonged nature of the torture they had inflicted upon their most vulnerable charge. The perpetrators were handed down sentences that guaranteed they would spend the remainder of their natural lives behind bars, entirely stripped of their freedom and permanently separated from the cultural network of the village. While the final strike of the judge's gavel officially closed the legal chapter of the tragedy in Iliili, it could not erase the profound, lingering scars left on the community. The legal resolution provided necessary accountability, but the true weight of the tragedy, the agonizing silence of the victim, and the catastrophic failure of the communal safety net would continue to haunt the territory long after the courtroom doors had been closed. The extensive legal record generated by this trial now stands as a dark, permanent archive, documenting exactly what happens when the vital connections of community fail and a child is left entirely alone to face the absolute worst of human nature, serving as a permanent warning to society. When the final echoes of the judicial proceedings subsided and the perpetrators were removed to begin their life sentences, a heavy, contemplative stillness settled over the territory of American Samoa. The closing of a criminal trial often brings a formal sense of resolution to the legal system, a definitive checking of boxes that signals the end of an official process. However, For the people of Ely Ely and the broader Pacific community, the conclusion of the court case was not an end, but the beginning of an enduring, painful confrontation with the reality of what had occurred in their midst. The physical village of Ely Ely returned to its familiar rhythms, with the tropical breeze moving through the palm trees and the daily life of the community continuing under the Pacific sun. Yet, the social landscape had been permanently altered. The house where the child had suffered stood as a silent, grim reminder of a catastrophic breakdown in the human landscape, forcing everyone who passed it to grapple with the realization that the deepest horrors can exist in absolute proximity to the most normal aspects of daily life. The true aftermath of the Ely Ely tragedy manifested as a profound cultural crisis that challenged the foundational myths of the society. In the traditional framework of American Samoa, the concept of the Aga, or extended family, is not simply a social structure, but a sacred moral compact. It is an overarching network designed to ensure that no individual, particularly a vulnerable child, is ever left without a collective shield of protection and care. The revelation that a child had been systematically starved, tortured with hard objects, and left to endure the agonizing healing of multiple bone fractures within the heart of this traditional system caused a deep wave of communal shame. It forced a painful recognition that the cultural safety nets, which had been relied upon for generations to safeguard the youth, had failed completely in this instance. The crime was widely recognized not merely as a violation of territorial law, but as a direct betrayal of the sacred values that define the very core of Samoan life, leaving the community to question how such a severe corruption of their most cherished traditions could occur without detection. This cultural reckoning inevitably focused on the terrifying silence that had enveloped the child suffering for so long. In a village where homes are built close together and daily existence is inherently communal, the fact that a sustained campaign of physical destruction could take place unnoticed was a paradox that the public could not easily reconcile. The investigation had revealed that the abusers successfully exploited the traditional respect for family autonomy, using the privacy of the domestic sphere as an absolute barrier against outside scrutiny. The aftermath of the case forced a critical evaluation of this social boundary. The community had to confront the uncomfortable truth that their reluctance to intervene in the internal affairs of a household had inadvertently provided the perpetrators with the perfect environment to execute their cruelty. The silence of the neighborhood had acted as an unintended shield for the abusers, proving that a lack of vigilance can be just as devastating as active malice when a vulnerable life is hanging in the balance. To ensure that such a profound failure of the communal safety net could never happen again, the public anger and grief were channeled into an urgent, widespread movement for social change. This collective determination gave birth to the territory-wide campaigns centered around the directive to see something and say something. This initiative represented a fundamental shift in the social consciousness of the community, actively encouraging individuals to prioritize the safety of a child over any traditional hesitation to look behind a neighbor's curtain. The campaign sought to dismantle the culture of non-interference that the abusers in Ely Ely had so effectively weaponized. It re-emphasized the traditional principle that the protection of the youth is a collective, non-negotiable duty of the entire village, transforming the passive awareness of neighbors into an active system of communal vigilance designed to detect and report the earliest signs of domestic distress or child endangerment. Parallel to this grassroots cultural shift, the tragedy triggered immediate and sweeping transformations within the institutional frameworks of the territory. The local child protective services and social welfare agencies underwent a comprehensive restructuring of their operational protocols. The authorities recognized that the existing systems had been entirely inadequate to pierce the veil of secrecy maintained by the guardians in the Ely Ely case. In response, the government implemented significantly stricter and more aggressive screening and inspection procedures for families identified as high risk. Social workers were granted expanded mandates and more rigorous guidelines to conduct thorough, unannounced welfare checks, ensuring that the physical condition, nutritional status, and living environments of vulnerable children were evaluated with clinical precision rather than relying on casual reassurances from caregivers. Furthermore, The territorial government recognized the critical need for immediate, accessible pathways for individuals to report suspected abuse without fear of social retaliation or bureaucratic delay. To address this structural vulnerability, significant resources were funneled into expanding and strengthening emergency rescue hotlines. These hotlines were upgraded to provide continuous, confidential support, ensuring that any distress signal from the community could be received, processed, and acted upon by law enforcement and welfare agencies with maximum speed. The expansion of these resources was a direct systemic response to the silence that had doomed the victim in Ely Ely, creating a modern, technological safety net to supplement the traditional structures of the village, and to guarantee that a direct line of rescue was always available for those trapped in situations of hidden domestic violence. Beyond the immediate borders of American Samoa, the Ely Ely case evolved into a landmark reference point within the broader fields of social work, public policy, and criminal psychology across the entire Pacific region. The detailed medical documentation from the Lyndon B. Johnson Medical Center and the harrowing investigative findings became a core subject of study in academic seminars and professional conferences. Experts in human behavior and child welfare analyzed the case as a definitive, tragic example of a complete systemic failure of the family welfare network. The case study demonstrated to professionals how a multi-layered system of physical abuse, weaponized starvation, and severe medical neglect could be successfully hidden within a highly communal society, serving as a stark warning to social workers across the Pacific that traditional cultural structures cannot be blindly assumed to provide absolute protection without active, independent institutional oversight. The academic and professional focus on the tragedy ensured that the nameless child's suffering was not forgotten, but was instead utilized to train future generations of protectors. The physical evidence left on the victim's body, the overlapping layers of scars, the distorted calluses of untreated fractures, and the profound biological degradation caused by clinical malnutrition, offered an undeniable baseline for understanding the extreme dynamics of domestic torture. By studying the specific mechanisms of isolation and control employed by the guardians, researchers and policymakers were able to develop more sophisticated diagnostic tools to identify the subtle indicators of hidden abuse in other communities. The legacy of the case became permanently intertwined with the advancement of child protection methodologies, ensuring that the lessons learned from the failure in Ely Ely were embedded into the structural training of social workers and law enforcement officers throughout the region. Ultimately, the deepest reflection left by this tragedy centers on the profound injustice of the child's experience and the collective obligation to honor their memory through continuous vigilance. True crime narratives often focus on the mechanics of detection and the drama of the courtroom, but the true core of this narrative is the solitary endurance of a young soul who is completely abandoned by the people and the society that should have offered absolute safety. The victim lived and died in a parallel reality of constant terror, a reality that existed just a few feet away from the normal, vibrant life of a peaceful village. The child's silent passing in the trauma room of the medical center was the tragic result of a world that looked away when it should have looked closer, a world that chose silence when it should have raised its voice in anger. The story of the Ely Ely case remains a permanent, somber meditation on the true meaning of community and the fragility of human life. It serves as an unyielding reminder that the strength of a society is measured entirely by how it protects its most vulnerable and defenseless members. The systemic overhauls, the implementation of the See Something and Say Something campaigns, and the stricter institutional checks on high-risk families stand as monuments to a collective promise made in the wake of an unforgivable disaster. The memory of the child remains an active, warning force within the territory, an invisible presence that demands absolute commitment from every neighbor, every relative, and every citizen to ensure that no home is ever allowed to become an isolated island of torment, and that no cry for help is ever again swallowed by a suffocating wall of silence. The passage of time across the volcanic landscape of Tutuila has a way of smoothing over the sharpest edges of historical grief, yet the profound echoes of the tragedy in the village of Ely Ely remain entirely unyielding to the steady march of years. In the broader landscape of true crime narratives, the conclusion of a high-profile trial and the subsequent locking of prison doors often signals a definitive end to the story, allowing the public consciousness to move forward to the next unfolding crisis. For the community of American Samoa, however, the closure of the legal ledger was merely the beginning of a permanent, multi-generational journey of remembrance and systemic reformation. The physical environment of Iliili, with its closely grouped homes and vibrant tropical surroundings, continues to function as a living testament to a lesson learned at an unimaginable cost. The silence that once blanketed the village, a passive and devastating silence that allowed a sustained campaign of physical torture to exist completely unchecked, has been permanently replaced by a deeply deliberate, protective awareness. The community has come to understand that healing from a catastrophic failure of the collective safety net requires a perpetual commitment to remembrance, ensuring that the short, agonizing life of the young victim remains an active, guiding force in the daily choices of every resident. To truly understand the long-term legacy of this case is to examine the profound structural evolution that occurred within the traditional framework of FAA Samoa and the institution of the AGA. The tragedy did not result in the abandonment of these ancient cultural pillars. Rather, it forced a rigorous, painful internal audit of how these structures operate in the modern era. The realization that the sacred trust of collective protection had been so thoroughly compromised within an autonomous household sent shockwaves through the generational hierarchies of the territory. The elders and community leaders were forced to confront the reality that the traditional respect for domestic privacy had been weaponized by the abusers, turned into an absolute shield to conceal systemic starvation, deep tissue contusions, and the agonizing healing of multiple untreated bone fractures. In the aftermath, the definition of family responsibility underwent a necessary and protective expansion. The AGA was reclaimed not as a system that hides its internal wounds to preserve an illusion of honor, but as an active, transparent alliance dedicated entirely to the absolute safety of its most vulnerable members. The preservation of a child's life was firmly elevated above any cultural hesitation to intervene, permanently altering the moral landscape of the village network. This cultural shift found its most visible expression in the institutionalization of the territory-wide campaigns centered around the directive to see something and say something. In the years following the trial, this philosophy transitioned from a temporary crisis slogan into an ingrained social habit, a fundamental rewriting of the unspoken rules of neighborhood interaction. The psychological mechanics of this transformation required a deliberate dismantling of the long-standing culture of non-interference. Neighbors who had previously conditioned themselves to ignore distressing noises, sudden absences, or subtle changes in a child's physical appearance began to view vigilance as a shared, mandatory civic duty. The campaign successfully reframed the act of reporting suspected domestic abuse not as an invasive betrayal of a neighbor's privacy, but as an act of profound cultural alignment, an assertion that the entire village is the ultimate guardian of every child born within its borders. This act of vigilance acts as a permanent barrier against the absolute isolation that the perpetrators in Iliili were able to construct, ensuring that no child can ever again be systematically erased from the communal eye while living just a few feet away from safety. Simultaneously, the medical and forensic legacy of the case permanently transformed the operational protocols within the Lyndon B. Johnson Tropical Medical Center, the very institution where the horrific reality of the crime was first brought into the light. The meticulously compiled medical files, detailing the tragic mosaic of overlapping old and new lacerations, the radiological records of improperly healed skeletal fractures, and the chemical evidence of terminal clinical malnutrition, became a foundational text for the region's healthcare infrastructure. The medical professionals who had witnessed the catastrophic multi-system trauma firsthand channeled their collective grief into the development of highly sophisticated, uncompromising diagnostic standards for identifying pediatric abuse. The clinical indicators derived from the victim's autopsy were integrated into mandatory training programs for emergency room staff, pediatricians, and nurses throughout the territory. The hospital evolved into a highly sensitive radar system designed to detect the earliest, most subtle physical markers of systemic trauma long before a child's internal systems could reach the irreversible threshold of immune collapse and systemic infection that proved fatal to the young victim in Ely Ely. The institutional memory of the Lyndon B. Johnson Medical Center stands as a permanent bulwark against the evasion of parental responsibility, providing a model for forensic precision that has been emulated across the Pacific. Every aspect of the victim's physical degradation, the way the weaponized starvation stripped away protective muscle tissue, leaving the bone structure entirely exposed to the blunt force of hard objects, was analyzed to understand the complex interplay between active violence and passive neglect. This clinical data ensured that medical examiners across the region were equipped with unassailable frameworks to present in future judicial proceedings, completely eliminating the ability of abusers to claim that advanced emaciation or historical trauma was the result of natural illness or unavoidable poverty. The child's body, which had been forced to serve as a silent archive of torment during their short life, was transformed through forensic science into a permanent instrument of legal truth, providing the exact scientific language necessary to secure absolute accountability in the face of domestic cruelty. On a governmental and administrative level, the permanent transformations triggered by the Ely Ely tragedy completely overhauled the mechanics of child protective services and social welfare throughout American Samoa. The territorial authorities recognized that a passive, reactive approach to family welfare was entirely insufficient to protect children trapped in environments of calculated isolation. Consequently, the government enacted rigorous, mandatory policies requiring aggressive screening and comprehensive background evaluations for households identified as high risk or vulnerable. Social workers were equipped with significantly expanded legal mandates, allowing them to bypass traditional family pushback to conduct thorough, unannounced physical inspections of domestic environments. These welfare checks were redesigned to include direct, independent assessments of a child's nutritional status, physical health, and overall living conditions, completely removing the reliance on the verbal assurances of guardians who might be hiding ongoing patterns of severe physical abuse or medical neglect. To support this proactive regulatory framework, the territory invested heavily in the permanent expansion and technological modernization of its emergency rescue hotlines. These communication lines were transformed into highly secure, continuous lifelines that operate entirely outside the traditional social pressures of the village hierarchy. The government recognized that for a neighbor or an extended family member to break the silence in a tight-knit community, they required an absolute guarantee of confidentiality and immediate, decisive action from law enforcement. The upgraded hotline system provided a direct, frictionless channel for distress signals to be received, logged, and investigated by specialized child protection units within hours of a report. This systemic upgrade was a direct, structural answer to the failure of communication that had isolated the victim in Ely Ely, ensuring that anyone who chose to follow the directive to see something and say something was backed by the full, immediate, and unyielding power of the territorial justice system. Beyond the geographic boundaries of American Samoa, the historical narrative of the Ely Ely case has maintained a permanent presence within the broader fields of criminal psychology, victimology, and social work across the entire Pacific region. The case is frequently cited in regional conferences and academic journals as the definitive, textbook study of family welfare network failure within a hypercommunal society. It serves as a stark, universal warning to policymakers and practitioners that the perceived strength of traditional communal bonds must never be used as an excuse to substitute for rigorous, independent institutional oversight. The tragedy demonstrated with devastating clarity that the closer and more interconnected a community appears on the surface, the more sophisticated and absolute the mechanisms of domestic concealment can become if perpetrators choose to weaponize cultural norms of privacy and autonomy. The ongoing study of the Ely Ely dossier ensures that social work professionals throughout the Pacific remain hyper-aware of the hidden dynamics of domestic torture, utilizing the lessons of this failure to constantly refine their methods of intervention and rescue. This enduring academic and institutional focus means that the anonymous child who suffered in that Ely Ely home has been granted a profound, protective immortality. While their name was shielded by the courts to preserve human dignity, Their historical legacy is written into the very laws, protocols, and social campaigns that protect thousands of children across the Pacific today. The true measure of justice in a case of this magnitude can never be fully satisfied by the mere imposition of life sentences on the perpetrators. True justice is an ongoing, daily practice that manifests in every child who is successfully removed from an abusive home, every neighbor who chooses to raise their voice, and every social worker who conducts a rigorous, life-saving inspection. The legal system did its duty in the courtroom, but the true custodian of the child's memory is the society itself, which has chosen to bear the permanent psychological scar of this tragedy as a necessary reminder of the price of complacency. The story of Ili Ili ultimately stands as a permanent meditation on the profound nature of collective human responsibility. It challenges the comfortable assumption that peace and safety are the natural, automatic states of a close-knit community, proving instead that they are fragile conditions that require constant, unyielding cultivation and absolute transparency. The memory of the young victim remains a solemn, quiet guardian over the territory of American Samoa, a permanent reminder that the walls of a home must never be allowed to become an absolute barrier to human empathy and protection. As the community continues to move forward, the legacy of the case ensures that the devastating silence of the past has been permanently replaced by a culture of loud, uncompromising vigilance. The collective promise made in the shadow of this tragedy remains unbroken, that the territory will never again look away, that the village will always listen, and that no child will ever be left to navigate the darkness of domestic torment entirely alone, isolated from the collective embrace of a society that has finally learned how to see, how to speak, and how to protect. The ultimate resolution of a true crime narrative is frequently misunderstood as the moment the final legal judgments are handed down and the prison doors are permanently locked behind those who perpetrated the unthinkable. Within the bureaucratic framework of the territorial justice system, the conclusion of the trial involving the guardians from the village of Ili Ili was indeed recorded as a definitive closing of a homicide dossier, an official certification that accountability had been delivered in accordance with the law. Yet, for the social fabric of American Samoa, the true resolution of this historic tragedy is an ongoing, daily process that spans across years and generations, manifesting not in the sterile text of legal archives but in the collective conscience of an entire society. The documents generated during the investigation and subsequent trial, detailing the multi-layered map of pain, the systematic starvation, and the catastrophic failure of the communal safety net, have not been permitted to gather dust in the dark basements of the courthouse. Instead, they have been transformed into a living, unyielding constitution of child protection, a permanent framework that constantly demands the absolute attention of every citizen, every leader, and every family unit across the islands. The physical village of Ili Ili, while maintaining its peaceful appearance against the backdrop of the Pacific Ocean, now exists as a community that has been deeply and permanently re-engineered by the lessons of its darkest hour, serving as a solemn blueprint for how a society must actively work to ensure that the hidden torment of a vulnerable child can never again find a place to hide. This ongoing transformation requires a continuous, uncompromising deconstruction of the social dynamics that allowed the young victim to become completely invisible within a hyper-communal environment. The central paradox of the Ili Ili case, the reality that severe, prolonged physical trauma and advanced clinical malnutrition could exist entirely undetected in a setting where households are physically and culturally intertwined, remains the primary subject of reflection for community advocates and social psychologists throughout the territory. The aftermath of the trial forced a permanent shift in how the community defines the boundaries of neighborly respect and family autonomy. For generations, the traditional principles of the Aga and the internal sovereignty of the household were treated as absolute, creating an unspoken rule of non-interference that, in this tragic instance, was maliciously exploited by the abusers to create a sealed vault of cruelty. The societal reformation that followed successfully overturned this culture of passive non-interference, replacing it with a collective understanding that true respect for a neighbor involves an absolute commitment to the safety of the children living under their roof. The long-term success of the territory-wide campaigns centered around the directive to see something and say something is entirely dependent on this psychological shift, ensuring that the passive observation of a community is permanently converted into an active, protective shield that actively monitors the well-being of its youngest members. The permanent evolution of the healthcare protocols within the Lyndon B. Johnson Tropical Medical Center stands as another critical pillar of the case's enduring legacy, providing a continuous, clinical defense system against pediatric domestic violence. The emergency room where the child's multi-system trauma was first brought into the public eye has become a center for specialized forensic training, utilizing the detailed records of this specific tragedy to educate medical professionals across the South Pacific. The clinical data derived from the victim's autopsy, which meticulously mapped the overlapping layers of fresh and old lacerations, the distorted internal calluses of untreated skeletal fractures, and the profound physiological devastation caused by weaponized starvation, is utilized as a definitive reference model for identifying the complex indicators of long-term child abuse. Medical professionals are no longer trained to view injuries in isolation. Instead, they're taught to read the human body as a historical document, analyzing the chronological relationship between wounds to identify patterns of systemic cruelty long before the victim's internal systems reach the point of irreversible immune collapse. This rigorous, forensic approach to pediatric medicine ensures that the medical center remains an active, highly sensitive radar system, completely removing the ability of abusive caregivers to conceal prolonged violence behind the excuse of accidental falls or socioeconomic hardship. On an institutional and legislative level, the structural changes triggered by the failure in Ili have completely rewritten the operational manuals of social welfare and law enforcement agencies throughout American Samoa. The territorial government recognized that a reactive welfare system, which only intervenes after a crisis has spilled over into the public sphere, was entirely insufficient to protect children trapped in situations of deliberate domestic isolation. Consequently, the administrative framework was completely overhauled to implement mandatory, aggressive screening protocols for families identified as high-risk or vulnerable. Social workers were stripped of the bureaucratic limitations that previously hindered their ability to challenge family pushback, granting them the explicit legal authority to conduct comprehensive, unannounced physical inspections of domestic spaces. These inspections are designed to evaluate the total living environment of the child, including direct assessments of their nutritional intake, physical hygiene, and overall safety, ensuring that the state no longer relies on the verbal assurances of guardians who might be actively executing a campaign of physical degradation behind closed doors. To ensure that these proactive institutional interventions are constantly supported by the vigilance of the public, the territory invested heavily in the permanent expansion and technological modernization of its emergency rescue hotlines. These communication networks were deliberately structured to bypass the traditional social pressures and familial hierarchies that historically contributed to the wall of silence within the village structure. The modern hotline system provides an absolute guarantee of anonymity and confidentiality, creating a secure, frictionless pathway for neighbors, teachers, or extended family members to report suspected instances of domestic abuse without fear of social ostracization or community retaliation. The incoming distress signals are integrated into a centralized tracking system that mandates immediate, coordinated responses from specialized child protection units and law enforcement officers within hours of a report. This systemic upgrade represents a direct, technological answer to the communication failures that isolated the young victim in Ili, ensuring that the collective voice of a vigilant community can instantly mobilize the full, protective power of the state to rescue a child from an environment of hidden torment. Beyond the immediate geographic boundaries of Tutuila, the historical narrative of the Ili case has maintained a permanent, influential presence within the broader academic and professional fields of victimology and criminal psychology across the entire Pacific region. The tragedy is frequently analyzed in regional conferences and policy summits as the definitive case study of family welfare network failure within a traditional, hypercommunal society. It serves as a stark, universal reminder to social work practitioners that the surface-level closeness of a community must never be used as a justification to substitute for independent, rigorous institutional oversight. The extensive documentation of the case demonstrates with devastating precision how perpetrators can successfully manipulate cultural norms of privacy and autonomy to create a parallel reality of absolute terror for a helpless dependent. The ongoing integration of these lessons into the university curricula and professional training modules throughout the region ensures that future generations of social workers, law enforcement officials, and child advocates are hyper-aware of the hidden dynamics of domestic torture, utilizing the tragedy of Ely Ely to constantly refine their methods of detection, intervention, and prevention. This enduring institutional and cultural legacy means that the nameless child who suffered within that Ely Ely home has been granted a profound, protective immortality that continues to safeguard thousands of lives across the territory. While the judicial system carefully shielded the child's identity to preserve basic human dignity, their historical experience is permanently written into the very laws, medical protocols, and social habits that define modern life in American Samoa. The true measure of justice in a case of this staggering magnitude can never be fully realized by the mere fulfillment of life sentences by the perpetrators. True justice is an active, daily practice that manifests in every neighborhood that refuses to look away, every citizen who chooses to raise their voice in defense of a child, and every social worker who conducts a rigorous, life-saving intervention. The legal system successfully executed its mandate within the courtroom, but the true custodian of the victim's memory remains the society itself, which has chosen to bear the permanent psychological scar of this tragedy as an essential, non-negotiable reminder of the ultimate cost of communal complacency. The story of the Ely Ely case ultimately stands as an permanent, deeply moving meditation on the fundamental nature of collective human responsibility within a civilized society. It shatters the comfortable, passive assumption that peace, safety, and the protection of the vulnerable are natural states of being that require no active maintenance, proving instead that they are fragile conditions that demand constant, unyielding cultivation and absolute transparency. The memory of the young victim remains a solemn, quiet guardian over the villages of American Samoa, a permanent reminder that the walls of a domestic dwelling must never be permitted to become an absolute barrier to human empathy, vigilance, and protective intervention. As the territory continues to move forward into the future, the legacy of this tragedy ensures that the devastating, historical silence of the past has been permanently and irrevocably replaced by a culture of loud, uncompromising protection. The collective promise made in the shadow of this disaster remains entirely unbroken, that the community will never again look away, that the village will always listen, and that no child will ever again be left to navigate the terrifying darkness of domestic torment entirely alone, forever isolated from the collective, healing embrace of a society that has finally learned how to see, how to speak, and how to defend its most precious trust. The long-term resolution of a catastrophic societal failure is never truly captured by the closing statements of a prosecutor or the cold entry of a guilty verdict into the municipal archives of a territory. For the islands of American Samoa, and specifically for the close-knit community of Ely Ely, the true conclusion of this harrowing narrative has become a continuous, generational endeavor that echoes through the daily lives of its people long after the physical actors in this tragedy have been removed from society. The story of the nameless child who suffered behind closed doors does not fade into the background of historical anomalies. Instead, it has been deliberately woven into the moral and structural foundation of the territory's modern existence. When we look at the physical village today, with its vibrant coastal scenery and homes built in close proximity, we are looking at a space that has been profoundly reordered by the memory of an absolute betrayal. The suffocating silence that once protected the abusers within their domestic sanctuary has been permanently shattered, replaced by a deep, collective understanding that the safety of a child is an absolute responsibility that supersedes any traditional desire for privacy or non-interference. To fully appreciate the scope of this ongoing resolution, one must observe the deep transformation that has taken place within the psychological infrastructure of the village community. In the immediate aftermath of the trial, when the horrifying details of overlapping scars, untreated bone fractures, and weaponized starvation were laid bare before the public, The initial reaction of deep shame and cultural shock gave way to a structured, intentional reimagining of communal life. The traditional concept of the Aga, which had historically been understood as a self-governing unit of absolute autonomy, was critically evaluated and expanded to ensure that its internal mechanisms could never again be corrupted to hide the systematic destruction of a human being. The elders and community leaders of Ili Ili took the lead in establishing an unwritten but deeply understood social compact that redefined the boundaries of neighborly vigilance. The physical layout of the village, where families live within the immediate sight and sound of one another, was transformed from an environment of passive observation into an active network of mutual protection, ensuring that the normal rhythms of daily life are constantly underpinned by an unyielding awareness of the welfare of every dependent child. This profound shift in social behavior is directly sustained by the ongoing implementation of the territory-wide See Something and Say Something initiative, which has evolved from a reactionary public safety campaign into a permanent cultural habit. The success of this movement relies on a continuous, conscious decision by individual community members to reject the historical comfort of looking away when encountering signs of domestic distress. In the years that have followed the historic trial, this philosophy has been deeply integrated into the socialization of younger generations, teaching them that true loyalty to the principles of Fa Samoa requires an absolute intolerance for hidden cruelty. The cultural hesitation to intervene in the internal affairs of a household, which the perpetrators in Ili Ili so effectively weaponized to isolate their young victim, has been completely replaced by a collective understanding that a cry for help from behind any door is an explicit summons to the entire village network, ensuring that isolation can never again be used as a tool of domestic torture. Simultaneously, the permanent integration of the forensic and clinical lessons learned from this case has fundamentally transformed the educational and operational structures of the Lyndon B. Johnson Tropical Medical Center. The medical facility, which served as the final sanctuary where the child's multi-system trauma was exposed to the world, has preserved the clinical documentation of this tragedy as a core pedagogical framework for pediatric medicine and forensic nursing across the South Pacific. The detailed mapping of the victim's physical degradation, the precise tracking of how prolonged, systematic starvation systematically dismantled the body's immune defenses, leaving it entirely vulnerable to fatal systemic infection through open wounds, is utilized to train incoming healthcare professionals to recognize the complex, multi-layered indicators of chronic domestic violence. Doctors and nurses are educated to look far beneath the surface of acute injuries, analyzing the chronological relationship between old scar tissue and fresh trauma to identify patterns of long-term abuse long before a vulnerable patient reaches the point of physiological collapse, ensuring that the hospital remains a vigilant, uncompromising barrier against parental deception and neglect. This clinical legacy extends far beyond the examination rooms of the medical center, deeply influencing the academic curricula of social work and public policy programs throughout the region. The Ili Ili case dossier has become a definitive text for understanding the specific dynamics of family welfare network failure within traditional, hypercommunal societies, serving as a universal warning that structural closeness does not automatically guarantee human safety. Researchers and policy advocates study the systematic methods of concealment employed by the guardians to understand how severe, long-term physical trauma and extreme emaciation can be hidden in plain sight, utilizing these insights to develop more sophisticated, independent oversight mechanisms that do not rely solely on the self-reporting of caregivers. By transforming the memory of the child's suffering into a rigorous scientific and educational tool, the territory has ensured that the victim's historical experience continues to actively inform the protective methodologies used to safeguard thousands of children across the Pacific. On an administrative and legislative level, the structural changes that were written in the wake of the Ili Ili tragedy have established a permanent, proactive framework for state intervention that actively challenges the isolation of high-risk families. The Territorial Child Protective Services were completely liberated from the historical bureaucratic limitations that had previously prevented them from conducting independent investigations without explicit parental consent. Today, the welfare agencies operate under strict, mandatory protocols that require regular, unannounced physical inspections of households that exhibit indicators of domestic instability or isolation. These checks are designed to be comprehensively objective, requiring social workers to directly verify the nutritional health, physical well-being, and medical history of every child in the home, completely eliminating the ability of abusive guardians to hide ongoing violence behind casual social excuses or extended absences from the public eye. To permanently support this aggressive regulatory framework, the territory has maintained a continuous commitment to the modernization and absolute confidentiality of its emergency rescue hotlines. These communication lifelines were specifically engineered to provide a secure, frictionless channel that bypasses the traditional social pressures and familial obligations that can often discourage individuals from reporting abuse within tight-knit communities. The system ensures that any report of suspected child abuse or medical neglect is immediately routed to a centralized database that mandates a coordinated, rapid response from both law enforcement and specialized child welfare units within hours of the notification. This structural upgrade has effectively democratized the responsibility of child protection, giving every citizen, neighbor, and teacher an anonymous, direct line to the full protective power of the state, ensuring that the wall of silence that proved fatal to the victim in Ely Ely can never again be constructed around an abusive home. Ultimately, the deepest and most enduring reflection left by the legacy of this case centers on the profound meaning of memory and collective redemption within a society that has looked directly into its own darkest corners. True crime narratives often find their narrative satisfaction in the mechanics of forensic detection or the dramatic finality of a courtroom verdict, but the true substance of the Ely Ely story lies in the silent, daily commitment of an entire people to honor a life that was systematically hollowed out by cruelty. The nameless child who endured unimaginable physical agony, who navigated the excruciating healing of untreated fractures in complete isolation, and who succumbed to the overwhelming weight of multi-system trauma, has been granted a profound and protective immortality through the permanent reformation of the society that failed to save them. The memory of that suffering remains an active, warning presence across American Samoa, a permanent reminder that peace is not merely the absence of visible conflict, but a continuous, active practice of empathy, transparency, and unyielding vigilance. As the village of Ely Ely moves forward into the future, the permanent cultural and institutional changes implemented in the shadow of this disaster stand as an unbroken promise to the innocent. The story remains an enduring testament to the reality that the strength of any community is measured entirely by its willingness to protect its most vulnerable members, and that the walls of a home must never be allowed to become an absolute barrier to human compassion and legal oversight. The devastating silence of the past has been permanently replaced by a culture of loud, uncompromising protection, ensuring that the territory will always watch, that the village will always listen, and that no child will ever again be left to face the terrifying darkness of domestic torment entirely alone, forever secure in the collective, unyielding embrace of a society that has finally learned how to see, how to speak, and how to defend its most sacred trust. The final resolution of a catastrophic societal failure is never truly captured by the closing statements of a prosecutor, the mechanical filing of legal briefs, or the cold entry of a guilty verdict into the municipal archives of a territory. For the islands of American Samoa, and specifically for the close-knit community of Ely Ely, the true conclusion of this harrowing true crime narrative has become a continuous, generational endeavor that echoes through the daily lives of its people long after the physical actors in this tragedy have been permanently removed from society. The story of the nameless child who suffered behind closed doors does not fade into the background of historical anomalies. Instead, it has been deliberately and permanently woven into the moral, cultural, and structural foundation of the territory's modern existence. When we look at the physical village of Ely Ely today, with its vibrant coastal scenery, lush volcanic landscapes, and homes built in immediate proximity to one another, we are looking at a social space that has been profoundly and irrevocably reordered by the memory of an absolute betrayal. The suffocating silence that once protected the abusers within their domestic sanctuary has been permanently shattered, replaced by a deep, collective understanding that the safety of a vulnerable child is an absolute, non-negotiable responsibility that completely supersedes any traditional desire for domestic privacy or neighborly non-interference. To fully appreciate the scope of this ongoing resolution, one must observe the deep transformation that has taken place within the psychological infrastructure of the village community itself. In the immediate aftermath of the trial, when the horrifying details of overlapping scars, untreated bone fractures, and weaponized starvation were laid bare before the public, the initial reaction of deep communal shame and cultural shock gave way to a structured, intentional reimagining of communal life. The traditional concept of the Aga, which had historically been understood as a self-governing unit of absolute domestic autonomy, was critically evaluated and expanded to ensure that its internal mechanisms could never again be corrupted to hide the systematic destruction of a human being. The elders, traditional leaders, and daily residents of Ili Ili took the lead in establishing an unwritten but deeply understood social compact that completely redefined the boundaries of neighborly vigilance. The physical layout of the village, where families live within the immediate sight and sound of one another, was transformed from an environment of passive observation into an active, protective network of mutual accountability, ensuring that the normal, vibrant rhythms of daily island life are constantly underpinned by an unyielding awareness of the welfare of every dependent child. This profound shift in social behavior is directly sustained by the ongoing implementation of the territory-wide See Something and Say Something initiative, which has successfully evolved from a reactionary public safety campaign into a permanent cultural habit. The success of this movement relies on a continuous, conscious decision by individual community members to reject the historical comfort of looking the other way when encountering signs of domestic distress. In the years that have followed the historic trial, this philosophy has been deeply integrated into the socialization of younger generations, teaching them that true loyalty to the core principles of FAA Samoa requires an absolute intolerance for hidden cruelty and familial neglect. The cultural hesitation to intervene in the internal affairs of a household, which the perpetrators in Ili Ili so effectively weaponized to isolate their young victim from the world, has been completely replaced by a collective understanding that a cry for help from behind any door is an explicit summons to the entire village network, ensuring that absolute isolation can never again be used as a tool of domestic torture. Simultaneously, the permanent integration of the forensic and clinical lessons learned from this case has fundamentally transformed the educational and operational structures of the Lyndon B. Johnson Tropical Medical Center. The medical facility, which served as the final sanctuary where the child's multi-system trauma was exposed to the world, has preserved the clinical documentation of this tragedy as a core pedagogical framework for pediatric medicine and forensic nursing across the South Pacific region. The detailed mapping of the victim's physical degradation, the precise tracking of how prolonged, systematic starvation systematically dismantled the body's immune defenses, leaving it entirely vulnerable to fatal systemic infection through open wounds, is utilized to train incoming healthcare professionals to recognize the complex, multi-layered indicators of chronic domestic violence. Doctors and nurses are educated to look far beneath the surface of acute injuries, analyzing the chronological relationship between old scar tissue and fresh trauma to identify patterns of long-term abuse long before a vulnerable patient reaches the point of physiological collapse, ensuring that the hospital remains a vigilant, uncompromising barrier against parental deception and medical neglect. This clinical legacy extends far beyond the examination rooms of the medical center, deeply influencing the academic curricula of social work, victimology, and public policy programs throughout the Pacific. The Ili Ili case dossier has become a definitive text for understanding the specific dynamics of family welfare network failure within traditional, hypercommunal societies, serving as a universal warning that structural closeness does not automatically guarantee human safety. Researchers and policy advocates study the systematic methods of concealment employed by the guardians to understand how severe, long-term physical trauma and extreme emaciation can be hidden in plain sight, utilizing these insights to develop more sophisticated, independent oversight mechanisms that do not rely solely on the self-reporting of caregivers. By transforming the memory of the child's suffering into a rigorous scientific and educational tool, the territory has ensured that the victim's historical experience continues to actively inform the protective methodologies used to safeguard thousands of children across the Pacific. On an administrative and legislative level, the structural changes that were written in the wake of the Ili Ili tragedy have established a permanent, proactive framework for state intervention that actively challenges the isolation of high-risk families. The Territorial Child Protective Services were completely liberated from the historical bureaucratic limitations that had previously prevented them from conducting independent investigations without explicit parental consent or cooperation. Today, the welfare agencies operate under strict, mandatory protocols that require regular, unannounced physical inspections of households that exhibit indicators of domestic instability or isolation. These checks are designed to be comprehensively objective, requiring social workers to directly verify the nutritional health, physical well-being, and medical history of every child in the home, completely eliminating the ability of abusive guardians to hide ongoing violence behind casual social excuses or extended absences from the public eye. To permanently support this aggressive regulatory framework, the territory has maintained a continuous commitment to the modernization and absolute confidentiality of its emergency rescue hotlines. These communication lifelines were specifically engineered to provide a secure, frictionless channel that bypasses the traditional social pressures and familial obligations that can often discourage individuals from reporting abuse within tight-knit communities. The system ensures that any report of suspected child abuse or medical neglect is immediately routed to a centralized database that mandates a coordinated, rapid response from both law enforcement and specialized child welfare units within hours of the notification. This structural upgrade has effectively democratized the responsibility of child protection, giving every citizen, neighbor, and teacher an anonymous, direct line to the full protective power of the state, ensuring that the wall of silence that proved fatal to the victim in Ili Ili can never again be constructed around an abusive home. Ultimately, the deepest and most enduring reflection left by the legacy of this case centers on the profound meaning of memory and collective redemption within a society that has looked directly into its own darkest corners. True crime narratives often find their narrative satisfaction in the mechanics of forensic detection or the dramatic finality of a courtroom verdict, but the true substance of the Ili Ili story lies in the silent, daily commitment of an entire people to honor a life that was systematically hollowed out by cruelty. The nameless child who endured unimaginable physical agony, who navigated the excruciating healing of untreated fractures in complete isolation, and who succumbed to the overwhelming weight of multi-system trauma, has been granted a profound and protective immortality through the permanent reformation of the society that failed to save them. The memory of that suffering remains an active, warning presence across American Samoa, a permanent reminder that peace is not merely the absence of visible conflict, but a continuous, active practice of empathy, transparency, and unyielding vigilance. As the village of Ili Ili moves forward into the future, the permanent cultural and institutional changes implemented in the shadow of this disaster stand as an unbroken promise to the innocent. The story remains an enduring testament to the reality that the strength of any community is measured entirely by its willingness to protect its most vulnerable members, and that the walls of a home must never be allowed to become an absolute barrier to human compassion and legal oversight. The devastating silence of the past has been permanently replaced by a culture of loud, uncompromising protection, ensuring that the territory will always watch, that the village will always listen, and that no child will ever again be left to face the terrifying darkness of domestic torment entirely alone, forever secure in the collective, unyielding embrace of a society that has finally learned how to see, how to speak, and how to defend its most sacred trust. The enduring narrative of the Ili Ili tragedy does not reach its conclusion within the sterile corridors of the Lyndon B. Johnson Medical Center or beneath the gavel of a territorial judge, for the true resolution of such a profound violation of the human spirit is an ongoing, generational process that requires the constant and active participation of the entire society. In the years following the definitive sentencing of the guardians, the village of Ili Ili has become a focal point for a radical and necessary reimagining of what it means to be a neighbor in a modern, yet traditionally rooted, island community. This process of communal healing and structural fortification has moved far beyond the initial stages of grief and anger, evolving instead into a permanent state of protective awareness that defines the daily interactions of the residents. The house that once served as a silent, impenetrable vault of suffering has been superseded by a village-wide philosophy that views every child as a shared, sacred trust, ensuring that the dark paradox of the past, where extreme cruelty coexisted with communal proximity, can never again find fertile ground. The tragedy has been transformed from a source of paralyzing shame into a catalyst for an uncompromising, proactive vigilance that has effectively rewritten the social contract of American Samoa. This ongoing resolution is deeply anchored in the psychological shift regarding the traditional boundaries of domestic autonomy and the cultural sanctity of the Aga. For decades, the cultural norms of the territory placed a high premium on the privacy of the individual household, a principle that, while intended to foster family dignity, inadvertently provided the absolute isolation required for the abusers in Iliili to execute their systematic campaign of torture. The aftermath of the case forced a painful but essential public dialogue about the limits of this autonomy. The community came to the collective realization that when the internal mechanisms of a family unit become a source of physical destruction, the right to privacy is immediately and irrevocably forfeited to the collective duty of protection. This realization has fundamentally altered the moral landscape of the village, empowering neighbors and extended family members to prioritize the physical and emotional safety of children over the fear of social discomfort or traditional non-interference. The culture of silence that proved fatal to the victim has been dismantled and replaced by a culture of transparent accountability, where the well-being of the most vulnerable is the ultimate metric of a family's standing within the village network. The structural manifestation of this cultural shift is most evident in the permanent integration of the see something, say something doctrine into the educational and religious institutions of the territory. This initiative has moved beyond the realm of public service announcements to become a core component of the moral education provided to the youth of American Samoa. In classrooms and village gatherings, the story of the failure in Iliili is utilized as a somber, cautionary lesson about the catastrophic consequences of collective inaction. By educating the younger generation on the specific warning signs of domestic abuse and the ethical imperative of intervention, the society is raising a new cohort of guardians who view communal vigilance as an essential expression of their cultural identity. This generational shift ensures that the protective reforms implemented in the wake of the tragedy are not merely temporary administrative changes, but are instead deeply embedded into the evolving DNA of the society, creating a permanent psychological barrier against the recurrence of such hidden horrors. Simultaneously, the forensic and medical legacy of the case continues to drive significant advancements in the training and specialization of healthcare professionals at the Lyndon B. Johnson Tropical Medical Center. The medical facility has established a permanent department dedicated to the study and prevention of pediatric trauma, utilizing the clinical records of the Iliili case as a primary diagnostic database. The detailed evidence of the victim's physiological collapse, the precise documentation of how chronic, weaponized starvation systematically dismantled the child's immune system, and how repeated blunt force trauma with hard objects created a permanent map of internal and external scarring, serves as a mandatory study for all incoming medical staff. This forensic rigor ensures that the hospital remains the territory's most advanced and uncompromising radar system, capable of detecting the earliest, most subtle indicators of systemic neglect or physical abuse. The medical professionals who now staff the center are trained to see through the deceptive narratives often provided by abusive caregivers, relying instead on the unassailable evidence written in the patient's biological and skeletal history to trigger immediate, life-saving interventions. This clinical vigilance is supported by a robust and highly modernized administrative framework within the territorial government, which has permanently moved away from the reactive policies of the past. The Child Protective Services in American Samoa now operate under a mandate of proactive engagement, particularly with households that exhibit patterns of social withdrawal or high-risk domestic indicators. The lessons of the Iliili case proved that the absence of reported conflict is not always an indicator of safety. Rather, it can be a sign of absolute, forced isolation. Consequently, social workers are now equipped with the resources and the legal authority to conduct thorough, independent assessments of child welfare that do not rely on the filtered reports of guardians. These protocols include mandatory, direct evaluations of a child's nutritional health, physical growth, and medical history, ensuring that the state maintains a clear and unmediated view of the living conditions within every home. This proactive stance is designed specifically to pierce the veil of domestic secrecy that was so successfully maintained in the Ely residence, making it impossible for a campaign of physical degradation to be carried out without detection by the territorial authorities. To further safeguard the integrity of this protective network, the territory has maintained a permanent commitment to the technological and operational expansion of its confidential reporting systems. The emergency rescue hotlines have been transformed into highly secure, multilingual platforms that offer an absolute guarantee of anonymity for those who come forward with information. These systems are designed to bypass the traditional, sometimes restrictive hierarchies of the village structure, providing a direct and frictionless path for any resident to mobilize the full power of the law in defense of a child. Every report is treated with the highest level of urgency, triggering a coordinated response from a multidisciplinary team of law enforcement officers, forensic medical experts, and social workers. This streamlined process ensures that the transition from a neighbor's observation to a formal state intervention is rapid and decisive, reflecting the community's collective determination that no child should ever again be left to endure a single night of domestic torment due to a breakdown in communication or a fear of social retribution. The enduring influence of the Ely case also extends into the broader Pacific region, where it serves as a landmark case study for the evolution of child protection policies in traditional societies. The tragedy is frequently cited in regional human rights summits and criminal psychology conferences as a definitive example of how cultural norms of privacy can be perverted to hide extreme human rights violations. The comprehensive documentation of the case, from the initial medical intervention to the final judicial outcome, provides a vital framework for other island nations seeking to strengthen their own family welfare systems. By sharing the painful lessons of the Ely failure, American Samoa has contributed significantly to a regional dialogue on the necessity of balancing cultural autonomy with the absolute, universal right of children to live free from violence and neglect. This regional legacy ensures that the suffering of the young victim in Ely has had a transformative impact far beyond the shores of Tutuila, influencing the protective strategies of social workers and policymakers across thousands of miles of the Pacific Ocean. Ultimately, the most profound resolution of this true crime narrative is found in the quiet, daily acts of protection that now define the village of Ely. It is found in the neighbor who notices a child's sudden absence and asks questions, in the teacher who recognizes the subtle signs of nutritional deprivation, and in the family member who chooses to break the silence to ensure the safety of a relative. These individual choices, multiplied across the entire community, represent the true and final defeat of the darkness that once occupied that home. The legal system has delivered its justice, and the medical system has refined its protocols, but the true custodians of the child's memory are the people themselves, who have transformed their collective grief into an unyielding, protective force. The nameless child who succumbed to the overwhelming weight of multi-system trauma in the hospital room so many years ago is honored every day by a society that has finally learned how to watch, how to speak, and how to defend the innocent with every breath it takes. The story of the Ely tragedy remains a permanent and somber meditation on the fragility of human safety and the absolute necessity of communal vigilance. It stands as a reminder that the greatest horrors do not always occur in the shadows of an unfamiliar city, but can sometimes hide in the most peaceful and close-knit villages, thriving in the spaces where silence is mistaken for respect. As American Samoa moves forward, the legacy of this case ensures that the devastating, historical silence of the past has been replaced by a culture of loud, uncompromising protection. The collective promise made in the shadow of this disaster remains unbroken, that the territory will never again look away, that the village will always listen, and that no child will ever again be left to navigate the terrifying darkness of domestic torment entirely alone, forever secure in the collective, unyielding embrace of a society that has finally learned the true cost of complacency and the infinite value of a single, protected life. The memory of the victim is not a burden of the past, but a light for the future, guiding the community toward a horizon where the sanctity of the child is the absolute and unquestioned foundation of every home and every heart.